Story 1. I remember the night he arrived because there was nothing remarkable about it, nothing to foreshadow how deeply the silence would settle into my bones. The van pulled up just after sundown, headlights skimming the edge of the empty lot, painting fleeting shadows across gravestones grown soft with moss. I'd been on shift since noon, long enough for my eyes to ache and my knuckles to feel every change in the temperature. The body came with the usual forms, zipped in a plain bag atop the stretcher, a clipboard clipped to the handle. No family at the door, no priest or mourner pacing the sidewalk, just the low murmur of the refrigeration unit and the shuffle of my own footsteps echoing down the corridor. The paperwork was flawless, stamped and initialed. Name, Edward Franklin Gray. Date of birth, date of death, social security number. Cause, cardiac event. Next of kin, none located. I set the phones aside and unzipped the bag with careful hands, ready for the familiar hush that always falls before the first viewing. He was ordinary at first glance average build, thinning hair, the ghost of a mustache across his upper lip, dressed in an old navy suit with a faded paisley tie. But even then, something about him resisted the neat logic of routine. His skin looked pale, but not the gray pallor of death, more like a waxen mask laid over something restless. His features seemed both familiar and foreign, and the way the shadows played across his jaw gave me the oddest impression that his face wasn't quite finished deciding who it belonged to. I wheeled him into the viewing room, set the casket gently on the supports, and checked the tag again. Edward Franklin Gray. The name didn't ring any bell, though I'd spent years reading obituaries, memorizing names, sometimes dreaming them in sequence on long, empty nights. No flowers had arrived. The file folder attached to the transport paperwork was almost empty. A few notes scrawled in an unfamiliar hand about the location where he'd been found and the time of death bare facts, uncolored by story or sentiment. Even his hospital bracelet looked oddly new, as if it had never wrapped a living wrist. The night wore on, and I busied myself with arrangements, adjusting the drapes, straightening the guest book no one would sign, checking the lights that flickered overhead with tired defiance. Each time I passed the casket, I found my eyes lingering too long on the man's hands, their knuckles pronounced but soft, as if they'd never done a day of hard work, and on the mouth, where the lips pressed together in a way that suggested he was just waiting for the right moment to speak. By the end of my shift, fatigue had settled like a film over everything, and I chalked my unease up to exhaustion, the peculiar sadness that clings to these solitary nights. Still, as I locked the viewing room and headed for the back office, I glanced once more at the body under its velvet shroud. For an instant, I thought I saw a flicker of movement, just a twitch of the jaw, a shifting of lines across his face, as if he were deciding how old he wanted to be. But then the room stilled, and I shook my head, promising myself a strong coffee in the morning and a firmer grip on reality. The name tag remained the same, crisp and certain, Edward Franklin Gray, yet I could not shake the feeling that I had welcomed someone into my care who belonged to more than one lifetime, a presence that waited, patient and unresolved, for the next act to begin. Dawn broke behind a heavy curtain of clouds, the kind of gray that blurs the edges of everything and makes the morning feel borrowed, unfinished. I let myself into the chapel a little after 6, the key scraping in the lock, the hush inside somehow deeper than usual. My thoughts lingered on the night before, on the way the dead man's features had seemed to hover between ages, on the odd weight in the room when I turned out the lights. I told myself it was nothing. The ordinary trick's exhaustion plays on a mind grown too used to shadows. As I wheeled the casket to the prep room for a final check before the burial, habit moved my hands. I peeled back the velvet cover, smoothed the suit, double-checked the tag, expecting to see the same expressionless face I'd left hours before. But when I looked down, every nerve in my body tightened. The man inside was not the one I had left. At least, not as he had been. The name tagged Edward Franklin Gray remained untouched, clipped neatly to the lapel. The suit, The tie, the arrangement of his hands were all identical, but the face staring up from the silk lining was that of a young man. Gone were the soft jowls, the droop at the eyelids, the silver at the temples. Instead, his skin looked smooth and tight, cheeks unlined, hair darker and thicker, lips fuller. There was an unsettling peace to his expression, as if he'd simply fallen asleep and dreamt his way backward through decades. I stepped back, dizzy, mind scrambling for explanations, mix-up, prank, some rare medical phenomenon, but none of them held for more than a moment. The records were clear. The clothes matched. The tag was unchanged. My own logbook, where I jotted notes about the condition of the body, now seemed less certain, my handwriting unsteady, as if I'd written about someone I'd never met. In a daze, I reached for my phone to photograph this impossible transformation, but as I scrolled through last night's images, the folder was empty. The pictures I'd taken for the file routine documentation, meant to prove the integrity of the process, were simply gone. No trace, no error message, just a blank where memory should be. The silence in the prep room thickened. I circled the casket, checking for hidden seams, for evidence of tampering, but there was nothing. Even the scent was different, lighter, as if the air itself had grown younger. Every so often, a chill ran up my spine, the kind you get when you feel someone watching. But when I glanced over my shoulder, there was only the hush of empty pews and the slow tick of the wall clock, marking a time that felt detached from everything else. I tried to reason it away, to tell myself I was tired, that this was a trick of the mind or the light, but the facts remained. The same body, the same clothes, the same name. Only the years had vanished, stripped away in a single night, leaving behind a version of the man that had never existed in the world I knew. For the first time in my career, I hesitated at the threshold of duty, unsure if the next person I'd see would be older, or younger, or someone I'd never recognize at all. The only constant was the name, Edward Franklin Gray, still waiting, as if his true age was yet to be decided by the living. The phone rang just past noon, its shrill note slicing through the muffled quiet that had settled since the morning's discovery. I answered with a voice that felt borrowed, brittle as old paper, half hoping the day would reset itself, that routine would return. Instead, I heard a woman's voice, soft, apologetic, explaining she was part of the family of Edward Franklin Gray, that a few relatives had finally gathered and would come by to view the body before the scheduled burial. She gave no reason for the delay. Her words were measured, tinged with the fatigue of someone carrying too many memories. I made preparations, straightening the chairs, checking the guest book again, though I knew no one had signed, wiping a stray smudge from the casket's lid. With each small task, my hands grew clumsier. I hovered by the chapel's doors as the family arrived, a small group wrapped in black coats, faces drawn tight with expectation and unease. When they entered, I watched them steal glances at the body, at one another, at the walls, as if trying to place themselves in a story that no longer fit. When the casket was opened for their inspection, there was an audible gasp from one of the mourners, a niece, I learned, who whispered that the man inside looked older than her uncle had ever been. It was true. The body that had been so strikingly young that morning now appeared aged, deeply so, the hair receding, lines etched into his forehead, the hands spotted with time. One mourner insisted this must be a mistake, that another body had been swapped in the night. But the tag was unchanged. The suit was the same, and I offered what reassurances I could, though my own heart thudded with disbelief. The family's confusion deepened when, after stepping away for a moment, just long enough to fetch coffee for the oldest in the group, I returned to find the mood had shifted. Another staff member, called in to witness, swore quietly that the man now looked almost middle-aged, as if the decades slid back and forth each time the room emptied and filled again. Over the course of that endless afternoon, more than one attendant claimed to have seen the features shift. Some reported a childlike roundness to the cheeks, others the drawn, bony sharpness of a man twice buried by sorrow. One young worker, eyes wide, confided to me in a whisper that the body had smiled at him, though he swore it was not the smile of anyone at rest. By evening, it was as if the room itself rebelled against finality, refusing the closure we were meant to provide. The air felt thick and stale, clocks slowed to a crawl, and the sun, though it should have set hung in the window, stuck at an angle that seemed neither day nor night. Each time the casket was closed, a strange tension filled the chapel, and each time it was reopened, it was as if we were meeting Edward Franklin Gray for the very first time, never knowing which version of his life or death we might find waiting inside. By the time the family left, shaken and silent, I stood alone among the flickering candles, certain that the hours had not truly passed, that the man before me was still choosing, moment by moment, which face the living would remember. In the hush after, I wondered if perhaps there are lives so unfinished, so unstuck in the world's current, that even death cannot decide where to leave them. Sleep came late that night, broken by uneasy dreams in which faces flickered like candle flames, young and old, familiar and not. By the time I returned to the cemetery, gray light was already pooling along the path. The previous day's confusion still clung to me, an ache at the back of my eyes, but curiosity now gnawed more sharply than dread. I couldn't let the thing go not when every version of Edward Franklin Gray had worn the same suit, held the same posture, and carried the same label pinned just so over his heart. It was as if the world demanded a name, even if it could not decide on a face. Compelled by something I couldn't quite name, I went down to the old archives, the smell of dust and yellowing paper thick in the narrow room. I pulled out the burial ledgers, running my fingers along lines of looping script and fading type. There, amid records going back decades, I saw it. Edward Franklin Gray, the same name, appearing not just once, but over and over, sometimes as a young man taken by fever, sometimes as an old man lost to winter, sometimes as a boy, sometimes as a veteran. Each entry bore a different date, a different plot number, but always the same name, the same quietly insistent signature pressed into the page. I checked the registers from other cemeteries in the county, borrowing books and calling in favors. Each time, the same pattern emerged. In every decade, there was an Edward Franklin Gray, sometimes with a new middle initial, sometimes with no birth year, but always accompanied by notes that trailed off into ellipses. Unclaimed, no known relatives, cause of death, varied. The deeper I looked, the more the story splintered, each fragment pointing back to the same inescapable truth. The man whose body rested in our chapel had been buried, and reburied, as far back as our records reached. Worse, when I tried to document what I'd found photocopying pages, taking snapshots with my phone, every image vanished. Where there should have been a picture, there was only a pale wash, a square of nothing. Even my notes warped and blurred, ink running as if dissolved by invisible tears. And when I confided in my colleagues, hoping someone would remember what I did, they faltered, recalling only half-formed images, a young man, or an old one, or a child, but never the same face twice. The only thread that never unraveled was the name, echoing through every record, every recollection, as constant as the stone markers in the earth. Standing in the quiet of the chapel that night, the casket closed and waiting, I felt a chill seep into my bones. I wondered what it meant to live and die under a name that would not let go. A name that dragged every face it wore back to the same resting place. Again and again. I wondered, too, if the dead sometimes linger not because they're forgotten, but because the world cannot bear to remember them any other way. And as the hours slipped by, I found myself waiting half in fear, half in awe, whatever version of Edward Franklin Gray would greet me next. The final evening fell with a kind of exhausted hush, the air outside dense and listless, and I found myself moving through the motions, as if underwater, every step slow, deliberate, haunted by the mystery I'd failed to unravel. After so many nights without answers, I had begun to accept that some stories were meant to remain unfinished, some questions never meant to be asked. Yet as I entered the chapel for what was supposed to be the last time, there was a new stillness in the room, less oppressive than before, as if the space itself had relaxed into a conclusion. I approached the casket with careful hands, heart beating with a strange mixture of anticipation and dread. When I lifted the lid, a sharp breath caught in my throat. There, nestled in the satin lining, was not the face of the old man I had prepared, nor the youthful stranger from before, nor any of the shifting in-between visages I'd glimpsed over those endless days. Instead, there was a boy no more than 7 or 8, his hair tousled, his hands folded neatly atop his chest, the same paisley tie awkwardly looped around a collar too large for his small frame. The name tag was still there, clipped to the lapel, Edward Franklin Gray. The suit, though comically oversized, was unmistakably the one I'd buttoned on the very first night. A wave of tenderness washed over me, so sharp it bordered on grief. The boy's face was peaceful, lips slightly parted in sleep, the barest trace of a smile at the corners of his mouth. For the first time since the body had arrived, I felt time move forward, the hands of the clock no longer stuck, but ticking, steady and unafraid. I reached out to adjust the tie, my fingers trembling as I tucked the fabric beneath his chin. His skin was warm, impossibly so, as if the last of someone's childhood dream had lingered here, refusing to fade. As I closed the lid for the last time, the shadows in the chapel softened. The electric lights grew warmer, the silence deepened, and I felt, though I could not explain why, that the long cycle had finally ended. But when I stepped away, the world around me seemed subtly altered. The lines on my palms were sharper, my hands stiffer, my breath catching as I moved. A glance at my reflection in the window showed a face just a little older than it had been before, the hair at my temples touched with an unfamiliar gray. I knew then that some part of Edward Franklin Gray would remain with me, as much a part of the living as of the dead, a reminder that every name, every face, every goodbye leaves its mark. And as I turned off the lights and locked the chapel doors behind me, I understood, with a shiver of awe, that the last chapter of every life is written not in stone or memory, but in the quiet transformation of those who bear witness. Story 2. The night started with the kind of ordinary chill I'd come to expect after decades behind the wheel, the air prickling at my skin as I signed for the transport and double-checked the paperwork under the humming fluorescence of the office. Everything about the job should have felt routine. The call had come from dispatch right as my shift began, crisp and official, with the location and instructions I'd followed more times than I cared to count. The body was to be moved from a modest funeral home on the far side of the county to a cemetery even further out Old Pinewood Rest, a place I'd visited in every season, the roads familiar, even by the waxy glare of the van's headlights. The folder handed to me was stamped and initialed, every field filled in with careful penmanship, every protocol followed, inventory of effects, details of embalming, certificate of death, chain of custody signed. The only detail out of place was the name, oddly formal, foreign to my ears, Alistair Vance, yet the letters were spelled out with such clarity. I wondered if I'd seen it on an old headstone before. There were no family members waiting at the door, no priest or mourner in the parking lot. The mortician, a thin, aging man with shaky hands, handed over the sealed casket without ceremony, barely meeting my eyes, as if the transaction was best conducted in silence. I loaded the casket with practiced care, the familiar heft and resistance, as it slid into the back of the van, oddly reassuring, like the repetition of an old song. The locks clicked shut, the paperwork went into the glove box, and I glanced one last time at the empty parking lot before climbing into the driver's seat. The route was imprinted in my memory, a series of backroads, 2-lane blacktop curling through woods and low fields, the sky overhead clouded and moonless. The digital clock on the dash showed 11:02 p.m. I turned the key, and the engine settled into its steady grumble. With the city lights receding in the mirror, I settled into the night, the radio low, the familiar ache of fatigue slipping over me like an old coat. Traffic was non-existent, and the world beyond the beams of my headlights seemed to shrink, all noise and presence stripped away by the darkness. My mind wandered, as it often did, thinking of the families I'd met and the miles I'd driven with nothing but the quiet certainty of my own company. Yet something about this job nagged at me. The emptiness of the funeral home, the way the mortician's hands trembled as he signed, the faint impression that the casket felt both heavier and lighter than it should. I told myself it was superstition, a relic of too many years ferrying the dead to rest. As I passed the old mill, the GPS chirped confirmation of the route, and I settled into the rhythm of the road. The only anomaly was the absolute silence behind me. No shifting of the casket, no stray creak from the supports, not even the muffled thud I'd grown used to when hitting a pothole. I checked the rear view out of habit and saw the vague outline of the box, shadowed and still, and a ripple of unease ran down my spine. The destination remained the same. I pressed on, determined to finish the job, certain that whatever doubts I felt would vanish with the coming dawn. Yet somewhere in the quiet, before the road curved into the forest and out of sight of any living thing, I began to feel as if the journey was not mine alone, and that something in the back of the van was waiting, patient and unhurried, for the part of the night when memory and reality would blur together, and even the most seasoned driver could lose his way. The road that had always been so familiar began to dissolve into something alien as the miles ticked by, the white lane markers drifting into darkness, roadside signs growing sparse and unreadable. The forest pressed in on either side of the narrow blacktop, trees leaning close in the headlights, their shadows drawn long and nervous across the windshield. I kept my eyes on the GPS, trusting it to carry me through muscle memory when my mind slipped. But then, with a soft electronic chime, the device recalculated rerouting. It flashed, the digital arrow spinning in a slow, uncertain circle. I frowned, glancing in the mirror to steady myself with the reassuring silhouette of the casket. But the compartment behind me was oddly dim. The familiar outline was still there, but it seemed to waver at the edges, as if shrinking into shadow. A few more turns, and the night itself felt different. Streetlights that should have dotted the roadside were missing. The names on the signs either faded to white or printed with letters I didn't recognize. The van's tires thrummed over rough pavement, and for a moment I thought I heard something shifting in the back, a faint scrape, a settling of wood. I eased the van over to the shoulder and braked, heart thudding. The dashboard clock read 12:21. The air in the van suddenly thick and close. I pressed the hazard lights, took a deep breath, and turned to look directly through the mesh partition. The back of the van was empty. Where the casket should have been bolted and strapped just minutes earlier, there was nothing but a long, bare expanse of floor. The moving blankets still perfectly folded, the tie-downs untouched. There was no sound, no crack of hinges, no echo of doors opening, not so much as a swirl of dust disturbed in the light. For a moment, I simply sat there, breathing shallow, trying to summon a memory of a stop, a turn, some accident that would explain the impossible. But the locks on the rear doors were unbroken, the latches still flush against the frame. A wave of nausea swept over me, sharp and cold. I checked the GPS, hoping for any answer, but it was still looping, spinning the route into itself, like a snake eating its own tail. When I got out of the van, the night seemed deeper, no wind, no distant highway hum, only the hush of trees, crowding close and silent. I opened the rear doors, hoping to see that the casket had simply shifted out of sight, but the compartment was clean, empty, undisturbed. No scratch marks, no smears, not even the faintest imprint left in the dust. I climbed back behind the wheel, sweat now prickling my brow. In the mirror, I caught a brief flicker my own reflection, hollow-eyed and pale, the face of someone about to remember something they've spent a lifetime forgetting. The van's engine idled in the stillness, but I had no idea which way to drive. The road behind looked just as uncertain as the road ahead, and somewhere in that liminal darkness, I realized I wasn't sure what I was transporting anymore, or whether the journey I'd started would ever reach a place that felt like home. I turned the key in the ignition, half expecting the van not to start, but the engine caught with a reluctant shudder, the radio spitting static before falling quiet again. I checked the glove box for my paperwork, searching for the comfort of familiar details and address, a name, anything to anchor me in the moment, but the folder felt strangely brittle. The pages within thin as moth wings, their ink faded to a watery gray. My own signature at the bottom of the delivery slip looked foreign, the loops and slants wrong, as if someone else had traced them over. I pressed the phone to my ear, dialing the number for the funeral home, but the line buzzed and clicked without ever connecting, every attempt dissolving into the same empty echo. The town should have been behind me, a scatter of yellow windows and the soft glow of porch lights. But when I turned the van around and drove back the way I'd come, nothing looked the same. The houses seemed older, their paint scoured to bare wood, mailboxes rusted, the sidewalks splintered and uneven. Even the funeral home itself, when I finally rolled into the gravel lot, looked transformed. The sign above the door was faded and warped, the letters peeling, and the windows reflected a hallway lined with antique wallpaper I didn't remember. The parking lot was empty except for my van, and the clock on the wall above the main desk, always set 10 minutes fast, now pointed to a time that made no sense at all. Its hands stuck at 3:13, the same minute I had glanced at during a funeral nearly 40 years ago. I stepped inside, the air thick with the smell of old varnish and dust, the silence broken only by the ticking of that impossible clock. No one answered when I called out. The rooms felt deeper, their shadows stretched and strange. My shoes left impressions in the dust on the linoleum, but there were no other footprints, no mortician waiting, no quiet humming from the back room, only the feeling of being watched by memories not entirely my own. I wandered to the storage bay where the casket had been loaded, hoping against reason for some clue, some mark to explain how an entire body could vanish between 1 mile and the next. The corners of the room felt unfamiliar, as if the space had shifted overnight. More clutter, fewer fluorescent bulbs. The calendar on the wall yellowed at the edges and turned to a year I couldn't place. When I checked my phone again, the date flickered once, then settled on a month from my childhood, decades past. I set my bag down, pressing my palms against the cool wood of the work table, listening to my own breath and the relentless ticking of the broken clock, trying to recall which version of the past I had returned to, or if I had ever truly left it. The only thing I knew for certain was that the casket was gone. The night had slipped its boundaries, and that I was suddenly a stranger in the place where I had always belonged. I moved instinctively through the dim corridors, feeling a growing sense of dislocation with every step, each doorway and faded wall both familiar and subtly wrong. Drawn back to the storage room, where, just hours ago, the casket had rested before my journey, I scanned the shelves and the empty space, searching for anything left behind. That's when I saw it, lying exactly where the casket had been. Illuminated by a pale ribbon of streetlight leaking through the high window was a single photograph. My pulse quickened as I approached, the sense of unreality sharpening until every movement felt like something from another person's memory. The photograph was old, the kind that feels fragile in the hand, its corners soft and curling, the colors faded to sepia. As I brought it closer, my breath caught. It was me, a version of myself I hadn't seen in decades, a boy of 7 or 8, grinning in a collared shirt, one hand clutching the edge of a rickety porch, the other held tightly by someone whose face was little more than a pale blur, features erased by time or intention. I flipped the photo over. Written in looping, unfamiliar script across the back were the words, "You always carried yourself." The sentence gave me chills, as if I'd heard it whispered in a dream or on the edge of sleep. I remembered the shirt, the porch, even the texture of the wood beneath my palm, but I couldn't place the day or the person whose hand held mine. I turned the photo in my hands, searching for context. Had it always been here, buried beneath decades of dust and routine? Or had it appeared just now, conjured by whatever had traveled with me that night in the van, unseen but not unfelt? For a long moment, I simply stood there, paralyzed by the weight of a memory I couldn't fully claim, the photograph trembling between my fingers. The room felt smaller, colder, and when I looked back to the doorway, for a split second, I thought I saw a shape standing there, a boy, his face hidden in shadow, watching with silent expectation. I tucked the photograph into my breast pocket, my mind spiraling through half-remembered stories and warnings I'd once dismissed as superstition. Whatever journey I'd begun with that vanished casket had twisted back toward me, folding time into itself, blurring the boundary between what had been buried and what refused to stay hidden. I realized, with a new kind of dread, that the night was far from over, and that whatever I was supposed to deliver to its destination was not resting easy. The job had become a reckoning, and I was no longer sure who or what was being carried home. I stayed frozen there, a photograph pressed between my fingers, my heart thudding in the hush of that strangely altered storeroom. When I finally forced myself to leave, the corridor outside seemed narrower, the overhead lights humming a little louder, their glow tinged with a faint, sickly yellow. I wandered in circles, the familiar floor plan refusing to line up with what I remembered doors led to the wrong rooms. The front desk was missing its chair, and even the clock behind the counter was running backward now, its hands spinning counter to logic or habit. I tried to call someone, anyone, but my phone only displayed static or lines of nonsensical numbers. Every attempt to reach the outside world brought only more silence. But always, inevitably, I found myself back in the storage room, as if every hallway now curved toward that single point. Each time I returned, something else had changed. A faded children's toy appeared on the counter. Paper airplane made of funeral paperwork tucked behind the radiator. A lone, battered shoe resting in the corner. The photo from before had moved it, now sat atop a crate near the door, and beside it, another image had appeared. Me, again, but older, standing in the funeral home parking lot, staring at the camera with a hollow, searching look. In my hands in the photo was a small wooden box, the kind used to hold mementos or ashes, but my mind recoiled from trying to remember ever holding such a thing. Desperate, I tried to leave by the front door. The knob turned, the hinges groaned, but outside was not the empty lot I'd expected. Instead, it was the same lonely stretch of road where the casket had vanished. Caught in the van's taillights, the night perfectly still, except for a single set of child-sized footprints leading away into the trees. I stepped back inside, my breath clouding, cold settling into my bones. Each time I left and re-entered, another object from my past had appeared somewhere in the building. A baseball cap from a forgotten summer, a birthday card written in my mother's hand, a stone I'd once kept in my pocket for luck. It became clear that the vanishing casket had not gone far. It was circling me, or perhaps I was circling it, pulled back again and again to these relics of a childhood I thought I'd left behind. And every time I returned to the storage bay, I found another photograph waiting for me, each one a little older, a little closer to the present, as if I was being shown my whole life in reverse, reminded that whatever I was carrying, it wasn't just a body, but the weight of every memory I'd tried to outdrive. I knew then that I was not done with the road, nor with what waited out there in the dark. The journey had only just begun, and with every new step, I felt myself slipping further from the world I once knew. The driver and the cargo blurring into the same endless, restless search for a place to finally rest. Story 3. It was the kind of late afternoon that painted the cemetery in layers of gold and copper, the last rays of sunlight stretching shadows across the uneven ground, each cross and headstone casting its own long memory toward the iron gates. I'd spent years arranging coffins for these communal burials, each one following the same routine numbered tags, careful spacing, The respectful silence of dusk settling in as families said their hurried goodbyes, or, as so often happened, simply didn't show. That day was no different at first. I lined up the coffins along the freshly dug row, the earth damp and dark underfoot, the air carrying the sharp scent of cut grass and distant smoke. I went about the task with the efficiency that comes from repetition, the kind of mechanical focus that keeps the mind from wandering into the sadness of it all. But as I bent to adjust the fourth casket, a plain, unadorned box with no flowers or ribbons, marked only by a generic tag, I noticed it was sitting just slightly out of line with the rest, a sliver of space beneath its base, as if it floated imperceptibly above the mud. I tried to nudge it, expecting the usual resistance of wood against wet ground, but it gave easily, gliding almost weightless for a moment before settling back into place. That's when I saw it. The casket cast no shadow. The sun was low, the angle perfect. Every other box, and even the shovels beside them, stretched out across the dirt in long, deep silhouettes. But not this one. No matter how I shifted my gaze, no matter where I stood, the pale wood absorbed the light, but offered nothing back to the ground beneath it. At first, I thought it was an illusion, maybe the grain of the wood, or a trick of the fading light, or something in my own tired eyes. I stepped away, blinking, and leaned in again, scanning the grass, the edges of the box, a tiny gap where the sunlight should have carved a line. Nothing. I walked in a slow circle, checking from every side, certain that sooner or later the angle would catch and the missing shadow would appear. Still nothing. It was as if the casket, or whatever was inside, existed just slightly out of sync with the world around it, untouched by the natural rules that bound everything else to the earth and to the slow, reliable passing of time. I felt a tightness in my chest, a cold finger running along my spine. I forced myself to continue, arranging the other coffins, checking the lists, calling out to the grounds crew for the final head count. Nobody else seemed to notice. The gravediggers smoked and joked and leaned on their shovels, the last sunlight tracing their arms, their hats, the caskets at their feet. Only one box remained untouched by shadow, stubbornly weightless, as if waiting for the darkness to find it, or for someone to notice it shouldn't be there at all. I told myself I'd look again when the light changed, that I'd find a reason and explanation that made sense, one I could write up in the daybook and forget by morning. But as I watched the sun sink below the fence and the last of the warmth slip from the ground, I knew that something about that coffin would follow me into the night, a weightless secret casting no shadow, quietly refusing to rest. Curiosity gnawed at me through the evening, refusing to let the memory of that shadowless coffin slip away. After the other burials were finished, and the grounds crew had drifted off for their supper, I made excuses to linger, waiting for the light to fade just enough that the last doubts might settle. The casket was still there, untouched, the wood pale and almost luminous in the cool blue approaching night. I moved it again, gently rocking it on its base, but it resisted nothing, almost as if it wanted to drift from my hands. I grabbed a flashlight from the truck and shined the beam straight at the box, sweeping it back and forth, looking for any hint of darkness, any interruption on the ground. The ray passed over the coffin and continued unbroken across the grass, as if the wood itself absorbed not just the light, but the very possibility of shadow. I tried with my phone's flashlight, with the high beams of my battered pickup, even with an old lantern someone had left in the shed. The result was always the same illumination that simply skipped over the casket, as though it wasn't there at all. I grew desperate to prove I wasn't losing my mind. I called over a coworker, Jake, who squinted in the dimness and shrugged, not understanding what I meant. "Looks fine to me," he muttered, then walked away with a shake of his head. But when I snapped a picture on my phone, the screen glitched for an instant, flickering between static and image, before showing nothing but a dark, shapeless blot where the coffin should have been. I tried again and again, but every image came out wrong, sometimes a blur, sometimes a total void, never the shape of what was in front of me. I started to worry I'd developed some sort of fever, or had inhaled too much chemical from the storage shed earlier. Yet each time I circled the casket, the same eerie absence followed me. In the fading light, no shadow. Under any artificial beam, no reflection. In every digital record, only darkness. I went home that night with a new sense of unease, unable to shake the feeling that the casket had brought something with it, something unbound by the sun, unwilling to be remembered by even the simplest mark on the ground. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I began to wonder what would happen if that darkness started to spread. By the time dawn spilled over the headstones the next day, I was restless, moving through my routine with an anxious edge. The night's unease clung to me as I walked the rows, checking the last burials, telling myself it was all in my head. But it was impossible to ignore the lingering cold where that shadowless coffin had sat, a chill that seeped through the grass and into my boots. As I cleaned my tools and stacked the boards near the tool shed, I caught a strange flicker in the corner of my eye, a ripple where my own shadow should have fallen. I stopped, staring at my feet, and watched the shape below me waver, then steady, then waver again. At first, it was subtle. The toes of my boots would lose their outline. My hands seemed to blur at the edges, the shadow shrinking and swelling with each uncertain step. I tested it in the bright sunlight, holding my hand out, expecting to see the familiar five-fingered silhouette on the gravel. But the pinky was missing, as if erased. Each time I walked past the plot where that coffin had been, the effect grew worse. My shadow would split, a thin strip lagging behind, then catching up, then slipping out of alignment. Sometimes it seemed to break entirely, an arm gone, the head stretched, the outline flickering like an old film reel caught between frames. My coworkers noticed something was off. "You look pale, man," one of them said, squinting at me from beneath the brim of his cap. "Get some sleep, yeah?" I laughed it off, made jokes about working too many night shifts, but my skin prickled with the knowledge that something was genuinely wrong. Each time I checked my reflection in a window, I found myself searching not for the lines on my face or the tiredness in my eyes, but for the shadow that should have stood at my side. By the end of the week, it was impossible to ignore. My shadow would twitch and spasm beneath me, sometimes separating completely, lingering a step behind as I walked. Once, as the sun set low and golden behind the weeping willow at the far end of the cemetery, I watched the darkness slip entirely free my outline, pausing at a crossroads of earth and light, while I stumbled forward, cold and alone. It felt like a warning, like whatever absence had been carried into the grave with that nameless body was now reaching for me, hungry for a host. And in those uneasy moments, I remembered how, just a few days before, one casket had refused the sun, had cast no shadow at all. Now it seemed that absence was slowly teaching me how to vanish too. As the days blurred into a nervous monotony, I became obsessed with that plot, checking on it during every break, scanning the earth for signs of disturbance, expecting to find the casket somehow missing or the soil split by something trying to crawl free. The grave itself remained untouched, no fresh footprints, no marks of animals, nothing but the heavy silence of an afternoon dragging into evening. I couldn't shake the urge to check inside. The paperwork from the burial had already vanished from the office, a blank spot in the registry book where the name should have been. I waited until the cemetery was empty, twilight settling over the stones, and walked out with a crowbar and a deepening sense of dread. I pried open the coffin, bracing myself for rot or some gruesome mistake. But what I saw made my skin crawl in a way no horror ever had. The body inside was uncorrupted, almost peaceful, as if the man had simply lain down for a nap and forgotten to wake up. But it was the face that caught me. Beneath the shallow, pale skin, I saw my own features softened, older, as if seen through a fogged mirror. For a breathless moment, it was my own eyes staring back, the ghost of a smirk at the corner of the mouth. The worst part was the faint shadow on the coffin's lining, as if some darkness was finally seeping out from under the lid, except that shadow seemed glued to me. When I stepped back, it followed, crawling up the wall, then sliding across the ground to settle at my feet. Attaching itself to my movements in place of my own, I staggered outside, gasping for air, trying to steady myself. Each step felt heavier, as if the grave itself was dragging me down. Wherever I turned, a shadow from the coffin clung to me, moving with a mind of its own, mimicking my every gesture, lagging behind a fraction of a second. The old comfort of sunlight on my back was gone. I moved through the world with a borrowed darkness, a thin, sticky presence that grew bolder every hour. I caught glimpses of myself in polished granite and car windows. My shadow's edges were sharper, stranger, its form not quite matching mine. It didn't take long before others noticed. A child passing with her mother glanced at my feet and burst into tears. The groundskeeper averted his gaze, mumbling an excuse about the light playing tricks. I began to realize that whatever had arrived in that coffin hadn't just brought an absence. It was here to claim a replacement, and the only shadow it wanted was mine. By the final evening, the sensation had become total a quiet terror, a loss you don't see until it's already complete. I walked the cemetery at sunset, moving like a man exiled from his own body, watching as every stone, every cross, every weed cast its own ordinary shadow on the ground. I alone left nothing. Not the faintest outline followed my boots, not the faintest flicker along the grass when I passed beneath the lamp at the gate. Even my reflection, when caught in the window of the caretaker's office, seemed grayer, thinner, as if it were losing substance with every hour that passed. It was only when I returned to that grave, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't resist, as if the last piece of myself was waiting there, I finally saw it. On the old stone wall that bordered the cemetery, stretched out in perfect evening light, was a single shadow, unmistakably mine, down to the hat, the stance, the awkward slope of my shoulders. It did not move when I did. It clung to the stone as if held by some memory of gravity or loyalty, refusing to follow me any further. I reached out, the tips of my fingers brushing the rough stone, desperate to call my own darkness back, but the air between us was cold and absolute. The grave below seemed to pulse, as if something inside had settled at last. The absence I'd carried these last days, heavy, silent, almost familiar, grew heavier, then faded. In that moment, I understood. My shadow was not gone, only left behind, exchanged for a burden no one else could see. Now, every evening, as the sun sinks and the cemetery empties, my body moves quietly among the stones, invisible in the golden light. But that shadow remains stuck, waiting, warning. A boundary no man should cross. A debt to be paid not with words, but with the slow, silent loss of something most people never think to miss. In this place, the world remembers every absence, and sometimes the only mark you leave behind is the one that doesn't follow you home. Story 4. It started on a Monday, like any other, with the kind of tired, gray morning that makes the city blur at the edges. I'd done these deliveries 1,000 times, cremation completed, papers signed, a box of ash handed over to a family that barely looked me in the eye. There was nothing unusual about the job that day. Not the long drive out past the empty lots and shuttered motels. Not the nervous woman at the door with the trembling hands. Not the way she repeated the name on the label, as if tasting a memory she didn't want to swallow. I passed her the urn, nodded my condolences, and watched as she disappeared inside, shutting the world and the weight behind her. The drive back to the funeral home was a silent one, the usual ache between my shoulders settling in as I counted the hours left in the shift. When I finally parked the van, the back seat was empty, except for an old coffee cup and a stack of faded receipts. The next morning, I slid behind the wheel for an early run routine. Predictable, just the way I liked it. Only this time, as I tossed my jacket into the back, I froze. There, perched perfectly upright on the vinyl seat, was the same black urn, the brass plate glinting with the same name, the sticker I'd peeled halfway off, still curling at the edge. For a split second, I convinced myself I'd brought the wrong one home. that maybe another family had declined delivery. Maybe I'd forgotten. Maybe it was all just a slip. But the delivery form was still in my pocket, signed, dated, everything in order. I even called the office. "Yes, Mr. Templeton. That one's marked as delivered," the woman at dispatch said, her voice bored, certain. "You signed for it yourself. The system's clear." I set the urn aside, locked it in the cabinet by the lockers, and did my rounds. That afternoon, I returned to the van for my last run. There it was again, sitting on the back seat, exactly where I'd first seen it. My pulse spiked, but I told myself there had to be an explanation. I went inside and asked around, half joking, "Someone messing with me? Who keeps putting this thing in my car?" The new guy blinked at me, said he hadn't touched a thing. My supervisor just grunted and told me to take it easy. Maybe I was working too hard. By the third morning, I stopped looking for logic and just stared at the urn. The label was starting to peel back more, the contents shifting with the faintest scrape whenever I turned a corner. The air in the van was tinged with the smell of dust and something older, a hint of burnt paper or singed leaves, the kind of scent that lingers in attics and memory. I drove all day with that box behind me, feeling it grow heavier in the silence, like a passenger who refused to leave. And each night, when I parked the van and went home, I'd glance over my shoulder before locking the door, half expecting, half dreading to see the brass gleam and the silent presence waiting for another ride. It didn't take long before the routine turned into something stranger, the kind of repetition that creeps into your bones and makes the world feel slightly off-center. Every morning, before the city stirred and before the funeral home buzzed with the low hum of sorrow and routine, I'd unlock the van, and there it was, the urn, precisely where I'd left it, never budging, never tipping over. No matter how sharp a turn I took, or how many potholes rattled through the suspension, it sat with a patience that almost mocked me, as if it knew I'd return. I started to dread this simple act of opening the door, the quiet certainty that nothing had changed and everything had. But then, one morning, I noticed something that made my breath catch. The urn felt heavier in my hands than before, just slightly enough to make me check the bottom for water, for dirt, for anything that could explain the difference. When I twisted the lid, I saw the ashes inside, just as gray and fine as ever, but there was more of it now, a line higher on the inside than I remembered. I told myself it was imagination, or maybe the powder had settled differently. Yet each new day, the weight grew. I stopped sleeping well, haunted by the idea of those ashes multiplying, growing in secret, while the world looked away. I started keeping a small notepad, jotting down the level of the dust, the exact weight, the time of morning I found it. My handwriting grew more frantic as I filled page after page. Heavier again, another inch, the stickers peeling back farther. I checked with the office again, hoping for some paperwork error, a family request for the urn's return, some excuse to explain the cycle. But the record was unchanged, delivered, and finalized. Nothing pending, nothing wrong. The others at the home started to avoid me, muttering about stress, the long hours, how the job sometimes played tricks on your head. I stopped trying to explain. I just carried the urn inside each night, sometimes hiding it at the back of a closet, sometimes locking it in the supply room, only to find it waiting for me the next morning, quietly demanding attention, quietly filling itself with more and more ash. The van began to smell faintly of burning wood, of time closing in on itself. I knew then that whatever I'd carried, I hadn't really delivered. I'd only brought it with me, and each sunrise meant it wanted to come back heavier, fuller, as if something unfinished was growing with the dawn. The morning it all changed, I was already on edge, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the keys, the heavy gray sky pressing low over the parking lot. The urn waited for me, silent and insistent. I almost didn't touch it, afraid of what it might weigh, of what new shape the day would take. But when I picked it up, I heard a dry, muffled clink from inside, a sound that had no place in a box of ash. I set it carefully on the passenger seat, heart pounding, and slowly unscrewed the lid. The ash rose in a fine, chill breath, and there, half buried in the gray powder, was a small toy car, its paint chipped and faded to the dull red of old memories. I knew that car. I had lost it as a boy, years ago, in a house my family had long since abandoned. I lifted it free with shaking fingers, brushing off the ash, feeling the weight of childhood settle cold and heavy in my palm. I didn't know what to think. There was no possible way for it to be here. It smelled faintly of smoke, and something else, candle wax and old earth, the perfume of places half remembered and never visited since. That day, I found myself afraid to check the urn, afraid of what else might be waiting. But as the week rolled on, each morning brought a new surprise, a yellowed photograph of me and my brother by the old apple tree, a plastic ring from a gumball machine, the medal I'd won in a third-grade spelling bee, objects I'd lost and forgotten, all of them mingled with the growing mound of ash. Sometimes there was a note, ink faded, in my mother's handwriting. Be careful out there. Once, a dog tag I'd never seen before, but with my name on it. I stopped mentioning any of it to the others. There was a silent agreement. Now no one wanted to know, no one wanted to see. The urn was invisible to them, its weight only mine to carry. I started to dread the coming of morning, to fear the next thing I'd find sifting through the dust. Each memory returned felt less like a gift and more like a warning. The past was filling up the space where the dead should have rested, and I was the only one left to sort through what belonged and what could never be let go. Each new object was another echo, a reminder that not everything we lose is truly gone, and not every burden is meant to be carried forward. By now, I'd given up trying to explain the impossible to anyone at the funeral home. The urn followed me everywhere, growing heavier with memories and objects I hadn't seen in decades. But when I tried to show it to a colleague, they looked at the empty seat and shrugged. Once, in desperation, I left it on the reception desk and asked the morning attendant to watch it while I ran an errand. When I returned, she insisted nothing had been there at all, just an empty counter, just an anxious look in my eyes, as if I'd forgotten something basic. Even when I took a photo with my phone, hoping to finally prove I wasn't losing my mind, the picture showed only the cracked vinyl of the seat, the faint outline of where the urn should have been, but never the urn itself or the objects inside it. It became a private haunting, a burden no one else could witness. The weight of the ashes pressed against the seams of the container, and each morning the pile grew higher, dust slipping through the threads of the lid, settling onto the floor mats and my clothes, marking my presence everywhere I went. And yet, the only proof I carried were the artifacts hidden in that ash pieces of my life that should have been long gone, now returned to me without any explanation. The photograph of my brother grew more faded each time I looked at it. The toy car lost some of its paint. The notes in my mother's hand began to curl at the edges as if touched by a silent fire. The more I tried to let go, to throw away the objects or bury the urn somewhere on the old service road behind the home, the quicker it would reappear, perched quietly on the driver's seat, waiting for me to acknowledge it again. I became wary of sleep, of dreams in which the ashes rose up around me, and the things I'd lost called me back one by one, asking to be returned, asking for the story to be finished. My colleagues noticed my exhaustion, the hollow way I moved through the halls, but they could never see the true reason, the invisible gravity of everything I'd ever loved or left behind, now circling me in a box that only I could open, only I could carry. Each day, the question grew sharper in my mind. Whose ashes was I really carrying? And what was being burned away with every new sunrise? The urn was never really for the dead. It was becoming a vessel for all the things I'd failed to let rest. A reminder that what's lost will find its own way home, and sometimes it comes back looking for you alone. On the final morning, I woke with the certainty that something would end that day, or begin again in a way I couldn't undo. The urn waited for me in the van, heavier than ever, the lid no longer fitting flush, ash spilling out in a thin gray seam. My hands shook as I tried to steady it, to press it closed, but it was useless. The contents had multiplied beyond measure, choking the air with their strange, musty scent. Nestled at the top, almost surfacing, was a slip of paper so pale it seemed woven from the dust itself. My name was written across it, every letter exact, with the date of my birth below. No date of death, just a line waiting to be filled. I took the urn inside, desperate to pass it off to someone else, to make it someone else's problem, but every attempt failed. Colleagues looked through me. The director said he was busy. The family at the door left with their own sorrow, unable to see what I carried in both arms. When I left it in the prep room and tried to walk away, I found it in the van when I returned, as if no time had passed at all. Even at home, it appeared beside my bed, silent and patient. The objects inside grew stranger now, not just things I remembered, but things I'd tried to forget. A letter I'd torn up in anger, a photograph of someone I wronged, a piece of broken glass that cut my finger as a child. It dawned on me that I wasn't just carrying ashes or mementos. I was delivering fragments of myself, piece by piece, every night, every day, losing parts I could never replace. I remembered the words on the last note, the ink already fading. What you never let go will never let you go. I tried to scatter the ashes at the river, to burn the paper, to hide the urn in the old mausoleum, but always it found its way back, a little fuller, a little heavier, a little more insistent. At last, I realized there was only one destination left. I drove out to the cemetery at dusk, urn in my lap, the van empty but for my own breath. The sky was flat and gray, the world suspended in that strange moment between endings and beginnings. I carried the urn to an unmarked plot at the edge of the grounds, the grass there soft and trampled by no one's footsteps but mine. I opened the lid and stared down at the swirling gray mass, now dense with lost things, forgotten words, childhood dreams, failures, and regrets. I whispered my own name, and the ashes seemed to settle, calm for the first time in weeks. I buried the urn deep, my fingers numb with cold, and covered it with earth until nothing showed, not even the smallest speck of dust. But as I turned to leave, I felt lighter and emptier, as if 1,000 pieces of my past had finally been laid to rest. Or perhaps I just joined them, a man walking away from his own memories, leaving them to drift and settle in the dark, silent ground, delivered, at last, to the only place they ever belonged. Story 5. There's a certain routine to the cemetery at dawn, the low golden light crawling over headstones, the chill that seeps through your boots even in summer, the silence that's almost heavy enough to press the grass flat. For 30 years, I'd known every rhythm and shadow in this place, every sound that didn't belong, every movement that caught the corner of my eye. But in all those years, I'd never seen anyone quite like her. She appeared in early spring, just as the ground thawed and the first new graves started to dot the rows. An old woman, tall despite her age, always dressed in the same faded black dress, with a thin, long coat fluttering behind her in the wind. Her hair was white, but pulled back so tightly it seemed to erase years from her face, and she walked with a kind of measured grace that made her look both frail and unbreakable. At first, I thought she was a relative, mourning someone newly buried, but it didn't take long to realize she visited every fresh grave, not just one. Sometimes she'd appear in the blue half-light before sunrise, a shadow drifting quietly between the stones. Sometimes just as the sky was turning pink and the birds began to chatter in the hedgerows. She never brought flowers, never left trinkets or photographs. Instead, she carried a small leather purse pressed close to her chest, and from it she would take a slip of paper, sometimes folded, sometimes rolled into a tight scroll, and place it carefully at the base of the headstone, as if entrusting a secret to the earth. I watched her from the maintenance shed at first, unsure whether to approach. She never noticed me, or if she did, she never let it show. She'd pause at each grave, her gloved hands trembling just slightly, and sometimes she would whisper words I couldn't catch. After a minute, she'd straighten up and move on to the next, repeating the ritual with the same deliberate tenderness. It struck me that she never seemed hurried or anxious. It didn't matter if the dew soaked her shoes or the wind cut through her coat. She moved with the patience of someone who'd waited all their life for this task. Week after week she came, and week after week I found myself charting her path. Some days she'd start at the southern fence, where the oldest graves lay, and wind her way up toward the new plots near the oaks. Other mornings she appeared out of nowhere near the service road, never arriving by car, never speaking to the groundskeepers. When I finally worked up the courage to step outside and greet her, she had already slipped away, lost between the rows before I could catch her eye. Even the others, those who worked alongside me for years, claimed they hadn't seen anyone unusual. "You're probably just seeing one of the regulars," they said, "someone coming early to beat the traffic." But I knew every face in this place, living and dead, and this woman was neither. The papers she left always vanished by midday, blown away or gathered up by some unseen hand. At first, I didn't pay them much mind, too busy with shovels and paperwork to notice scraps of litter. But soon, curiosity got the better of me. I started to collect the slips before the wind could take them, and what I found there, well, that was when everything started to change. It started as simple curiosity, a routine broken, a need to understand what this silent visitor was leaving behind in a place where most people want only to forget. The first note I picked up was just a few lines, written in looping script on pale, almost translucent paper. It was a memory, or something like it, about a boy fishing by a creek, the smell of wild onions in the mud, and the pride he felt when he brought home a fish for Sunday dinner. At first, I thought it was a message for the deceased, perhaps a ritual of closure or a way to honor a memory. But something about the details struck me, tugging at a corner of my own mind. My father had told that story 100 times at family gatherings. The boy was him. The creek was behind our old house. The wild onions a joke he shared with his brothers. My father had been dead 20 years. No one but family ever heard those stories. The next slip, left 2 graves down, was even stranger. It mentioned a girl named Ruth, who hid a silver locket beneath the porch after her mother died, swearing to dig it up when she was grown. My Aunt Ruth had confessed that secret to me at my mother's funeral, years before any of us were old enough to understand the weight of such keepsakes. The dates matched, the names were right, and the handwriting was oddly familiar. Not quite my mother's, not quite my own, but echoing something I'd seen in old birthday cards and faded recipes. Each day brought a new note, and each note a new story of childhood fever. A schoolyard fight, the name of a favorite teacher from my brother's class, the precise address of the house we lived in when I was 5. At first, I considered coincidence, but the pattern was undeniable. Every note contained some scrap of my own family history, the kinds of things never written down, never spoken outside our small circle. There were details even I had almost forgotten, names only spoken in the hush of bedtime, or over coffee in the kitchen late at night. The notes became more personal, more intimate, sometimes mentioning dreams I'd had as a child, nightmares of getting lost in the cornfields behind the church, memories that felt as private as breath. The realization crept in slow, like the rising cold in the early hours of autumn. The woman in black was not just mourning strangers. She was chronicling my life, my losses, my family's secrets, the invisible lineage of grief that wove through our blood. The names on the graves did not matter. The stories belonged to me, to those I'd loved and buried, and to those I barely remembered. It was as if she was mapping my memory across the cemetery, leaving breadcrumbs for me to find, leading me toward some conclusion I wasn't ready to face. I started to dread her visits as much as I needed them. I couldn't explain it to anyone. The grounds crew dismissed it, and my few friends thought I was losing myself to the job. But every morning I walked the rows, looking for those slips of paper, my heart pounding as I unfolded each one, half afraid of what part of me I'd find next. Obsessed now, I decided to learn everything I could about the woman in black, and her impossible knowledge. I adjusted my routine to overlap with her path, set silent alarms to wake before dawn, and took to lingering at the edges of the cemetery, even after my shift was over. Every time I caught sight of her, she was already halfway down a row, her pace measured and unwavering, each step echoing on the wet grass as if she walked in a world adjacent to mine. Once, just once, I called out a polite greeting, nothing more, but she never paused, never looked back, her silhouette dissolving behind the marble wings of a mausoleum or slipping between the trunks of the old maples near the perimeter fence. By the time I reached the spot where I'd seen her, the air was empty and still. One evening, I asked the security guard, a young guy who'd started only weeks ago, if he'd noticed anyone matching her description. He shrugged, eyes glazed with the boredom of too many night shifts, and said he hadn't seen a soul all week, just me. And sometimes he thought even I was a shadow passing through. It was the same with the other workers. Just you and the stones, they'd say, laughing off my questions. Maybe you're seeing the ghosts you keep burying. But I knew better. The evidence was there, tucked beneath the fresh sod and hidden behind headstones. Her notes, always multiplying, always turning up somewhere I'd only just left. Once, I doubled back on my own route, quietly circling a new grave as she paused beside it. I watched her from behind the tool shed, barely daring to breathe. She knelt, placed a folded paper on the stone, whispered something, my name, and when I blinked, she was gone. Other times, I tried to cut her off, to stand between her and her next destination. She'd vanish behind a row of vaults, but when I rushed to the other side, she'd already be at the far end of the cemetery, straightening her coat, the wind catching her hair as she bent over another grave. It was as if the land itself conspired to hide her from me, the ground swallowing her footsteps, the dusk bending light to her will. There was never a car, never a sign of arrival or departure, no record of entry at the front gate, only the endless, silent circuit of her mourning. No one remembered seeing her face, not even when I described her in careful detail. The black dress, the severe bun, a purse clutched like a rosary. To them, she didn't exist. To me, she became the only thing that did. The cemetery was her stage, and I, her sole audience, forced to watch and wonder as she retraced the grief and memories of my life. Each night, I wondered what would happen if she ever stopped, if the notes would stop appearing, if the stories would finally reach their end. I started to feel her presence, even when I didn't see her, as if she lingered just outside the edge of my vision, always searching, always remembering for me when I could not. As summer yielded to the brittle chill of early autumn, the woman in black's visits grew more frequent, almost nightly, as if she was working against some invisible deadline. I hardly slept, my thoughts churning with every secret unearthed from those notes, every memory recounted in handwriting, so achingly familiar it sometimes brought tears to my eyes. There was an inevitability to it, a sense that her pattern would eventually intersect with mine, her route tightening, drawing ever closer to a particular part of the grounds I had long avoided, the older section, where the stones were weathered smooth and names disappeared beneath centuries of moss. It was there, late one dusk, as shadows stretched long between the trees, that I finally saw her clearly. She knelt at a grave I passed thousands of times, but never really noticed a small stone, almost lost to the earth, with nothing but a single wilted flower resting atop it. The woman's head was bowed, her thin shoulders trembling as she smoothed the soil around the base of the marker. For a moment, I thought she was weeping, but when she lifted her face, her eyes were dry and sharp, fixed on me with a look that cut through every defense I had left. Drawn by a force I couldn't name, I stepped forward. My boots sunk into the soft ground, the world narrowing to the space between us. As I came to stand beside her, I looked down and felt the blood drain from my face. The name etched on the stone was my own. Full name, middle initial, date of birth exactly right. The date of death, though, was tomorrow's. I felt my legs buckle. I don't understand, I stammered, voice barely a whisper. She offered me a small, bittersweet smile, the kind my mother wore when I was too young to know how little I knew. "The family always needs someone to remember," she said softly. Her voice was gentle, but beneath it ran a current of something both ancient and tired. I looked at her again, truly looked at the lines around her mouth, the shape of her hands, the steady way she held my gaze, and something in me ached with recognition, as if I had always known her and simply forgotten. For a heartbeat, everything else vanished. The cemetery, the chill, even the fear. There was only her, and the certainty that I was standing at the intersection of all the stories, all the losses, all the long, lonely years I had tried to keep buried with the dead. She reached out and squeezed my hand, cold but real, and I understood she had not come for the others. Not really. All this time, she had been waiting for me. The air felt impossibly still after she vanished, the world locked in that fragile moment between memory and forgetting. I stood for a long time by the stone that bore my name, hand tingling with the chill of her touch, the echoes of her words circling in my mind like ravens at dusk. When the wind finally stirred, I saw it, a single folded slip of paper resting against the foot of the grave, anchored by a tiny white pebble. My knees shook as I bent to pick it up, my breath fogging the fading light, the scent of earth and old flowers filling my lungs. The paper was softer than any I'd touched before, as if worn thin by decades of careful handling. I unfolded it, expecting some final riddle, a secret, perhaps even a warning, but what I read struck me harder than anything that had come before. It was my mother's handwriting, unmistakable, even after all these years. Her looping script dancing between the lines with the patience of a woman who had written hundreds of notes for lunches, for birthdays, for the small encouragements a boy needed to grow. The note began with a story from my earliest childhood, something I'd nearly forgotten at time. I fell from a tree behind our house. The blood and panic and the way she'd calmed me, singing softly as she stitched my knee in the bathroom light. No one else alive could have known those words. The lullaby she'd whispered, the way she'd kissed my brow and told me, "You're safe. You're home." My vision blurred as I finished reading, every line peeling back another layer of the past, each detail a thread pulling me through the tapestry of my life. At the end, she'd signed her name and written, "No one is ever alone in a place of remembrance. I will always be here, in every story, every stone, every dusk." When I lifted my head, the woman was gone, no sign of her among the shadows, no trace of her passing between the stones. I looked around, searching for the other notes, but found only empty grass and the silent company of the graves. The cemetery was unchanged, yet I felt different, lighter and heavier all at once, as if I had been emptied out and filled with something older, deeper. The last note, trembling in my fingers, fluttered in the breeze, and I realized it was the only one that remained. All the others had vanished, leaving just this final message behind. As I pressed it to my heart, the sun slipped below the trees, and the first evening star winked above the darkening grounds. I understood then that every memory, every loss, every unspoken goodbye was a kind of inheritance, one I would carry, alone and never alone, until it was time for someone else to remember in turn. Story 6. I first noticed the old condolences book in the early years, back when I was still learning the routine rhythms of the cemetery, when to lower my head, when to step back, when to let the family's grief settle like dust before I swept the chapel at night. The book was already thick with years then, its cover worn to a faded navy, the corners curled as if by countless restless fingers. It lay on the little table beside the entrance, always open to the first blank line, pen looped through the spine, waiting for words of comfort or apology or confession. Most books lasted a season, maybe two, before the pages filled, and I'd archive them in the basement, their backs swelling with the weight of other people's sorrow. But this book, never grew any heavier, and it never left its place, no matter how many times I cleared the table or how many other ledgers came and went. Decades passed, Faces changed, priests retired, headstones crumbled, but the book remained. At first, I assumed the pages were replaced by the office staff, an old habit, maybe some tradition from before my time. But the spine never split, never showed the awkward lumps of amateur repair, and if I checked the count, it never changed. Always the same number of sheets, no matter how often it was written in. Sometimes I'd open it and see lines of neat script filling the page, only to find those same lines vanished the next day, replaced by different words and unfamiliar signatures. It was as if the book's memory stretched beyond the chapel walls, swallowing up years and giving them back in a new order. I started paying attention. After every funeral, I'd make a mental note of the last page, its lines and its ink. Sometimes, in the hush before the family arrived, I'd riffle through to the back, half expecting to find an end, a final signature, but there was always another blank page. If I pressed down on the spine, the paper gave way as though it was still fresh from the factory, unsullied by all the hands that had leaned over it, weeping or whispering, signing names for the dead. In the quiet evenings, when the chapel emptied and the sun cast long bars of light across the pews, I'd flip through the book, reading the old entries, tracing my own journey in the handwriting of strangers. At times, I found entries I swore I'd seen before, lines that repeated from years earlier, condolences echoing across time, with only the names swapped out, as if the grief here never truly changed, only shifted shape. Once or twice, I glimpsed a note signed in my own hand, though I didn't remember writing it, and the date was always impossibly recent, or just slightly ahead of where I stood. I grew accustomed to its presence, the way it anchored every ceremony, the way no one else seemed to question its longevity. For the families, it was a comfort. For me, it became a kind of riddle, a quiet companion as I aged into my role as the keeper of the resting. Looking back, I realize I measured the passing years not by my reflection in the window or the names carved on stone, but by the steady weight of that book. Even now, as I set it out for yet another service, pen glinting in the dawn, I wonder if it will ever truly fill, or if, long after I'm gone, it will remain a record of every loss and every forgotten goodbye, patiently waiting for the story to end. It's strange what becomes habit in this line of work. Some evenings, after the last car had rolled away and the echo of footsteps faded from the chapel stones, I'd find myself standing in front of the old condolences book, thumbing through its endless pages. At first, it was idle curiosity, something to do before locking up. But as the years slipped by, I began to notice things I couldn't explain, and the habit became more ritual, less comfort. There were entries in the book, written in the shaky hands of the elderly and the careful, looping script of the young, each line a private message for the deceased or their families. That part was expected. What unsettled me were the notes signed by people I'd never met, attached to funerals I could not recall. The book bore witness to griefs that didn't fit anywhere in my memory, names that weren't in the cemetery's registry, accounts of wakes I knew I hadn't prepared, little recollections of weather or music or laughter in the chapel that felt wholly out of place, like echoes of ceremonies in some parallel life. Sometimes I'd find whole pages written in handwriting eerily similar to my own, the letters formed with the familiar pressure, the odd kink of a Y, or the careful crossing of a T. These entries were different. They spoke of funerals not yet held, described seasons that hadn't come, referenced people whose faces I'd never seen. There were condolences for a Mr. Hargrove in the spring of 2028, a service for Sarah Wells on a rainy September night, dates in the future, names that meant nothing to me now, but sent a tremor through my chest, as if I'd glimpsed the shape of my own fate spelled out in advance. I'd close the book, unsettled, only to return the next week and find those same pages rewritten. Messages disappeared. New ones took their place. Occasionally, the book seemed to anticipate what was coming. There would be a note of sympathy for a family whose loss I hadn't yet heard about, or a little poem about the tall cypress near the back gate, before anyone had mentioned planting it. I told myself it was a trick of memory, that grief does strange things to the mind, but the more I read, the less certain I became. The past and the future seemed to blend together in those pages, moments bleeding into one another, handwriting from my own youth, mingling with a script I imagined might be my own in old age. It got so I couldn't stop myself from looking for messages addressed directly to me. At first, I found none, but then, hidden among the entries, I discovered a note in my own unmistakable scrawl, dated 5 years ahead, speaking of the hardest winter yet and a sorrow I had not anticipated. Reading it, I felt as if the years compressed into a single heartbeat. The book was keeping track of me, too, collecting all my unspoken fears and hidden memories and tucking them between condolences from strangers. I wondered then if the book was as endless as the work itself, stretching forward and backward, always ready to remind me that memory, like mourning, never really lets go. I never believed I'd lose track of my own handwriting. I've filled out enough death certificates, signed enough forms, and left enough careful notes in the staff log to know the shape of every letter I make. That's why it stopped me cold the morning I turned the old condolences book to a fresh page and found, halfway down, my signature first and last name, the curl of the G unmistakable, just as I've signed 1,000 times before. But the date beside it was from next year, a month and day not yet arrived, and the message written above was not one I'd ever spoken aloud, let alone written in sympathy to another. It read as if I'd attended a funeral I couldn't recall. It mentioned the winter cold, a blue scarf worn by a widow who wept alone at the far end of the chapel, the taste of bitter coffee, the way the light shifted on the marble floor as the casket passed. I recognized the scene, somehow felt it settle in my bones with that odd familiarity that sometimes comes in dreams. But when I scanned the names, none belonged to anyone buried in our grounds. The signature was mine, the words were mine, but the memory was not. I ran my finger under the ink, feeling for some roughness, some proof it was a forgery. But the paper was smooth and warm, as if the words had always lived there. More curious than frightened, I checked other entries. Again and again, my own hand appeared, sometimes alongside signatures from families long gone, sometimes in the middle of a page, squeezed in among strangers. The years didn't always go forward. Sometimes the date next to my name was years past, a funeral I did remember, but with words I never wrote. Sometimes it was a decade ahead, or a year already come and gone, as if I'd been both present and absent at once, always circling these ceremonies, always returning to this chapel and this book. What struck me most was the sense of inevitability the book gave off, the feeling that every funeral, every sorrow, every message left behind had already been written somewhere, and my part was only to discover them in the right order. I tried to show the page to a coworker one morning, but by the time I returned with him to the table, the signature had faded, replaced by a new condolence written in blocky, unfamiliar print. My own words, my own proof, erased in an instant. The book would not let anyone else see what I saw. That night, alone in my apartment, I dreamed I was writing in the condolences book with a pen I didn't recognize, surrounded by people whose faces I'd only seen in black and white photographs. I wrote page after page, signatures blooming beneath my hand, none of them mine, until finally I wrote my own name, over and over, as the pages turned and the years spun out before me. When I woke, the feeling lingered, the strange certainty that my future was already there, nestled somewhere in the endless pages, waiting for me to catch up. After that morning, I stopped trusting my own memory. The book seemed to sense my attention, and from that day on, it became even more capricious, almost playful in its way. Whenever I tried to retrace a specific message, a particular condolence that had caught my eye, maybe a note of apology from a son estranged, or a poem left by a woman who'd never signed her name, the entry would have vanished, moved elsewhere, or changed in some subtle way. Names would swap places. Dates would slide across the margins. Sometimes, the same signature appeared in 3 or 4 different years, each time offering a slightly different memory, as if the author had lived several lifetimes within these pages and wanted to see how each might be remembered. What unsettled me most was how the book always returned to the chapel, no matter what I did. On the rare occasions I tried to archive it, slipping it onto a shelf with other ledgers, or even locking it in the supply cabinet, I'd find it on the condolence table again, the very next service, open to a new page, waiting. I once left it deliberately half-filled, curious if someone would finish the sheet in my absence. When I returned, the page was not only full, but bore entries dated months apart, some written in a hand that looked remarkably like my own, but older, shakier, unfamiliar, even to me. Sometimes I'd skim the first pages only to find text from the back now in the front, or condolences that had been clearly written, for one person subtly reworded and now addressed to another. Occasionally, a message would repeat, almost verbatim, from years earlier, but the signature at the bottom would be different, maybe my own, maybe a stranger's, maybe the name of someone I'd never met, but felt I should know. The only constant was the sensation that the book was tracking me, shadowing my time here, blending the details of 100 funerals into one ceaseless procession. It made me wonder whether I was the one guiding the ceremonies at all, or just a witness to an unbroken thread of grief looping through the years. There were moments when I felt as if every condolence in that book, every line, was being written, not just for the bereaved, but for me, a silent record of everything I'd lost and everything I'd still lose, shuffled and reshaped with every turn of the page. Sometimes, late at night, I'd imagine that the book would only be finished when my own story had been written into it completely, from beginning to end, every sorrow finally accounted for in the shifting, endless record of the dead. It was a rain-soaked dusk when I realized the book was nearly open to the end, though I could never find its first page, nor remember ever seeing a back cover. After the last funeral that night, I returned to the chapel in the heavy silence that always follows the last mourners. There, the book waited, open on the condolence table, as if left just for me. I found it turned to a blank sheet, save for a single phrase written in a slanting, hurried script at the very bottom. When this book is full, it's your time to leave. A strange, private chill passed through me, colder than the wind slipping under the chapel door. I ran my thumb over the words, feeling the roughness of the page. But as I tried to close the book, another sheet unfurled itself from beneath my hand, then another, and another, each blank, each promising there would always be more to say. In the middle of these fresh pages, a note suddenly appeared in my own handwriting, unmistakable even in its trembling. My name, the date of the last service I would ever conduct, a funeral not yet announced. It was a quiet instruction, a memory written in advance. My breath caught, and for a long moment I simply stood, listening to the building settle and the rain knock softly on the chapel roof. The message was clear. The book's last page would not appear until I'd made every entry meant for me, until every goodbye had passed through my hands. I understood then that this ledger was not merely for the mourners or the dead. It was a record of my own passing years, my own losses, every kindness and burden etched in the margins. Each line a small act of remembrance for the keeper as much as for the kept. And when, at last, the book would be full, truly full, with no more space for any new sorrow or farewell, I would know it was time to close the chapel one final time, leave the condolence table as I found it, and walk out into the night, carrying with me the sum of all those lives and all those partings. The chapel would fall silent, the pages would rest, and my own story would finally take its place among the endless rows of names, as inevitable as the turning of the page. Story 7. The day Michael Crane arrived was colder than usual, the kind of chill that seeped into the stones lining the oldest part of the cemetery. That kept even the most routine duties feeling heavier. I remember the details because, at the time, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, at least, nothing more unusual than a late delivery and a file marked urgent. The funeral home van pulled up just after dawn, the sky still gray, and two attendants, both unfamiliar to me, carried out the casket with the kind of practiced silence that comes from years of this work. All the paperwork was in order. His name, Michael Crane, typed in neat capitals, matched the tag on the body, the death certificate, and the transport authorization. The family was listed as out of state. No one accompanied the transfer. The mortician on duty had already left for the day, so it fell to our small crew to lower the casket. Just me and Davis, who'd been at the job even longer than I had, but rarely spoke unless there was a problem. Michael Crane's file included a faded black and white photo clipped to the cover. A man in late middle age, hair cropped short, clean-shaven, with a tired, expectant look in his eyes. His cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest. The casket was plain pine, no engravings, just a brass nameplate that caught the early light. We handled the burial with our usual efficiency. There was no ceremony, no mourners, just the hush of wind through bare trees and the scrape of shovels against wet earth. When it was done, Davis and I signed the burial register, stamped the time, and left everything in good order. The only detail that stuck with me was how the ground felt unusually soft, almost as if it had been recently disturbed, though I knew we hadn't opened that plot in years. By the following Thursday, I'd nearly forgotten about Michael Crane. The cemetery always moved quickly, from one day to the next, one burial to another, each life blurring into the next set of chores. But when I checked the new burial schedule for the weekend, his name appeared again, this time listed in block letters at the top of the page. My first instinct was that someone had made a clerical error. Yet the paperwork, newly issued, again carried all the right seals and signatures. The death certificate had the same date. The description matched the previous file. Michael Crane, male, 62, no local relatives, cardiac arrest. I took the new file to the foreman, who raised an eyebrow but said little, only shrugged and told me to do it by the book. When the hearse rolled in that Saturday morning, I checked the casket twice. Same kind of wood, same plain finish, same brass nameplate. When we opened it to verify the body, I froze. It was Michael Crane, unmistakably sane set jaw, same thinning hair, but a faint mark on his chin that hadn't been there before, like a scar I hadn't noticed the first time. I told myself I must have missed it. The dead change quickly, after all. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of having been here before, repeating something I should remember but didn't. No one spoke of the repetition. Davis handled the casket with the same steady hands, and we laid Michael Crane to rest in a neighboring plot, following every rule. But the next week, his name appeared again and again. Each time, everything was in order. Each time, some small detail was different, just enough to leave me wondering whether I was losing my mind or whether the world had slipped imperceptibly into a cycle that only I could see. By the third week, Michael Crane had become a silent fixture in my thoughts, a presence that gnawed at the edges of my routine, eroding the comfort of repetition that had always defined my work. Each new arrival was marked by the same rigorously filed paperwork, the same impersonal van, and the same late hour that left the cemetery shrouded in that peculiar hush between dusk and true darkness. The office printer would spit out another burial schedule, and there, always on a fresh line, Michael Crane's name appeared in crisp black ink. Every detail was right down to the social security number, date of birth, even the attending physician's signature. But I began to dread the simple act of opening each new file, searching for any imperfection that might break the spell. No one else seemed to care. Davis grunted at the assignment, chalking it up to the kind of bureaucratic redundancy that plagued every city department. On the surface, it was all plausible reused forms, errors in data entry, maybe even the unfortunate coincidence of another man sharing the same name. But when we opened the casket, every time, there he was, Michael Crane, his features achingly familiar, but subtly changed. One week, the bridge of his nose bore a faint freckle that hadn't been there before. Another time, his hair was parted differently, just slightly, as if he'd slept on the wrong side. Once, I could have sworn his right canine tooth was chipped, though in my memory, it had always been whole. I took photographs with my phone to be sure, but by the time I checked my gallery later, the files were corrupted or simply gone, replaced with blank squares. The oddities spread to the paperwork. Sometimes, the font on the documents was minutely different serifs instead of sans. Dates printed in European format, initials that didn't belong to anyone in the office. I began to notice the name Michael Crane showing up in delivery logs from years past, even decades, names buried in lists I had never seen before, all linked to plots scattered throughout the cemetery. Each time, the address was different, the casket a new shade of wood, the brass nameplate slightly dulled or freshly polished. Davis eventually stopped answering my questions, muttering about how I was, overthinking a dead man's life. But I saw the way he looked at the casket each time, how he lingered a beat longer on the face beneath the glass, as if hoping to spot a change that might give us permission to stop burying him. The other workers began to avoid my shift, citing overtime or family plans, until most mornings it was just me, Michael Crane, and the restless wind threading through the rows of stone. No matter how many times we laid in to rest, the plot was never quite the same. Sometimes the earth was softer. Sometimes the grass around the grave wilted or grew in strange spiraling patterns. I would catch glimpses of a woman standing far off, always in black, always watching, but never close enough to speak. And each week, when we signed the burial register, our signatures stacked one after another. The line for Michael Crane's interment grew longer, until the ink from so many identical entries bled through the page, blurring the dates and times into a single, unbroken smear. Still, I never said no to the next burial. There was a compulsion to finish what we'd started, or maybe the quiet hope that the next casket would be the last, that the earth would finally be satisfied, and Michael Crane could rest for good. But every Monday, the list returned, and with it the familiar dread, the certainty that something fundamental was unraveling in ways only I seemed able or willing to notice. After a month, my own memories began to feel brittle, as if every Michael Crane we'd buried had chipped away something from the inside of my head. Conversations with Davis turned circular and confusing. I'd ask how many times we'd performed this burial, and he'd answer with a number that shifted each week: 3, 5, 7, never the same twice. I started writing down the dates and details in a pocket notebook, cross-referencing with the cemetery's digital system, but neither matched. In one logbook, Michael Crane was listed as buried on the 5th of March twice. In another, I found the same entry, dated a month apart, both with my signature in unmistakable handwriting. Sometimes, the penmanship shifted, as if someone had imitated my style, but missed the nuances and extra loop on the C, a heavier hand on the M. It got worse when I tried to talk to other staff. One afternoon, while moving earth from a newly assigned plot Michael Crane's, again, overheard 2 attendants arguing in the tool shed. One swore this was the 4th time he dug that same grave, that he remembered the exact shape of the roots, the way the headstone cast a shadow at noon. The other insisted it was only the 2nd, and said the previous Michael had a mole on his left cheek, not the right. When I joined in, trying to recall my own details, I found my recollections splitting in 2 sometimes. I remembered Michael Crane's hair as salt and pepper, sometimes jet black, sometimes thinning to gray. Some days, I'd be certain the man was left-handed, and other times, right. Photos, when they existed, only compounded the confusion. There were duplicate shots in the archives, same angle, same date stamp, but with the deceased's face altered in subtle ways. A different tie, a fresh cut on the chin, a gold ring swapped for silver. On nights when I stayed late, convinced I could finally catch the glitch, I'd find the files rearranged, file names replaced with long numbers that matched nothing in the database. Printed forms would change positions in the folder, with the earliest entries showing dates from years before I'd even started at the cemetery. It became difficult to trust my own timeline. I'd wake up, dress, check the burial schedule, and for a moment, I'd be unsure if it was this week's Michael Crane or last's. The staff room chatter always returned to him. Sometimes we'd talk about Michael, as if he were a recurring visitor, a strange guest passing through our hands again and again. Yet we never questioned why. Old-timers in the office joked that Crane must be working off a debt. But when I pressed for details, how many times, which plot, who attend, and nobody could say for certain. It was as if, with every cycle, the facts were sanded smooth, leaving only the feeling of repetition and the weight of something unfinished. Over time, my own face in the bathroom mirror looked less familiar. My eyes felt hollowed, sleep blurred by dreams in which I was lowering the same casket over and over, while voices whispered names and dates I could never quite remember upon waking. I began to worry that the cemetery itself was bending, warping, that we were all trapped in a loop that nobody could prove but everyone quietly endured. And always, at the heart of it, Michael Crane, his name on our tongues, his body in the ground, his story seeping into our memories like water into clay, until even our own histories felt as unstable as the dirt we turned with our shovels. It was a Sunday, and the air was thick with that uneasy quiet that settles in just before a storm. Another burial for Michael Crane, another identical pine casket delivered by the same battered hearse, its wheels crunching the gravel in a rhythm I could have set my watch by. I found myself walking to the chapel with a sense of dread that had become so familiar it might as well have been part of the uniform. Inside, the room was already arranged for the service. Chairs in neat rows, altar draped in black, 2 wreaths of fading laurel flanking the casket. But as I helped set the casket in place, I noticed it was already scratched, the wood marred by a series of overlapping dates carved in small. Uneven numbers, years passed, decades, some already faded, as if erased and rewritten. The same handful of mourners appeared, moving quietly into the chapel, all dressed in the same clothes they'd worn in previous ceremonies. I recognized them not by name, but by habit. The tall man in the brown overcoat who always stood by the door, the older woman who dabbed at dry eyes with the same crumpled handkerchief, a young girl with her hair tied in a red ribbon. It occurred to me, as they took their places, that I'd seen these faces before, and not just at 1 or 2 funerals, but every time we buried Michael Crane. Their expressions never changed, frozen somewhere between grief and resignation. And when the priest stepped to the lectern, he read the same passage I'd heard 6 times, his voice measured and hollow, the cadence identical to every previous service. I moved through the motions, lowering my head at the prayer, glancing at my watch as the words drifted overhead. It was as though time itself was coiling around us, refusing to move forward, trapping us in an endless sequence of farewells. Even the cemetery grounds seemed caught in the spell. The wind never picked up. The sun hung low behind the clouds, and the air held the faint scent of earth and fading flowers. When we carried the casket to the grave, I saw that the headstone was already in place, the date smoothed over so many times that the lettering was nearly illegible. As we set the casket on the lowering straps, I ran my hand along the lid, feeling the grooves of old marks, old efforts, as if the wood remembered every time it had been buried. During the committal, I noticed Davis watching the proceedings with a vacant gaze, his shovel already in hand, though there was no hurry, no reason to rush. I realized then that we were all repeating ourselves, our movements and words dictated by some script we could never escape, our memories of previous burials blurring into this one, until it was impossible to say if it was the first, the 5th, or the 50th. Even as the mourners departed in silence, their faces cast down, I wondered if they would return next week, and if they would recognize any difference, or if we'd all be back here again, playing our parts in the same old ritual. That night, as I locked up the tool shed, I looked back across the rows of graves and felt a chill at the thought that somewhere beneath the ground, Michael Crane was waiting for us to begin again. The earth was never disturbed for long. By morning, the grass would lie flat, the soil packed tight, the only trace a faint impression where the latest casket had rested. I stood for a long time in the dusk, listening for the sound of footsteps on gravel, the low murmur of a prayer, The echo of names I could no longer keep straight in my mind. It seemed the ceremony never ended, only paused, waiting for the next name to appear on the list, the next set of hands to carry the weight, the next cycle to begin anew. I suppose I should have seen it coming, the way each week Michael Crane's story blurred into mine, how his face on the mortuary slab sometimes seemed to carry the exhaustion of my own reflection. But denial is a skill well practiced in cemetery work. After another silent Monday, where even the birds avoided the yard, I slipped into the administration office early and began combing through the old, dust-crusted files in the metal cabinet at the back, those that hadn't yet been scanned into the digital system. My hands shook as I leafed through faded burial records, tracing names and dates, my own penmanship scattered among unfamiliar signatures. And then I found it, a thin folder labeled Future Services. Inside was a single page, my own name typed in bold at the top. Below it, the details of a burial scheduled for the following week. Every field was filled my full legal name, date of birth, assigned plot, and a death certificate marked with a date that hadn't yet arrived. For a long minute, I sat frozen, the page crinkling in my grip. The space for officiant was blank, as was the section for next of kin. But my own signature awkward, rushed, undeniably mine sprawled at the bottom as the preparer. I stared until my eyes blurred, unsure if this was a cruel prank or another of the cemetery's quiet impossibilities. When I finally looked up, my reflection in the glass-fronted cabinet door seemed thinner, more washed out. The color leached from my cheeks. I pressed the page to my chest and went out to the grounds, hoping the air would clear my head. But that afternoon, as I prepared for what I believed would be another Michael Crane burial, I noticed a difference. The new body, brought in under the same name, had features I could not deny: a scar across the brow, the curve of the mouth, a birthmark on the forearm. I touched my own face, my own arm, and felt the world tilt. The rest of the crew arrived, but as they glanced at me, something flickered in their eyes. A moment's hesitation, as if they saw someone else entirely. I tried to speak, to crack a joke about déjà vu, but my voice felt dry, the words hollow in my throat. At the graveside, as the coffin was lowered, I caught my reflection in the polished wood. It wavered, bending and twisting until the face staring back was not Michael's. Not really, but mine, older, sadder, worn thin by too many burials. My name echoed through my mind, repeated with each shove of earth, each murmured condolence. I realized then that in a place where the same man could die again and again, it was only a matter of time before I, too, became part of the story. Another name shuffled through records, another face for future generations to forget and rediscover. In the quiet that followed, the team drifted off one by one, leaving me alone beside the fresh mound of dirt, the headstone half engraved, my own name waiting to be completed. The evening air pressed close, and as the first drops of rain began to fall, I understood with a bone-deep certainty that the only difference between Michael Crane and myself was the order in which we were remembered, and the faces that would, inevitably, take our places next. The last shovel of earth fell, sealing another loop, another chapter, and I stood by the grave, knowing that soon, whether by error or design, the name they called would be mine, and I would answer, as all the others had, before and after. Story 8. For as long as I have worked these grounds, through the slow churn of seasons and years that blurred together in the hush of a cemetery's routines, there has been one plot in the oldest corner that refuses to fade like the rest. The others accumulate a patina of abandonment. Names lose their meaning beneath moss. Wreaths and bouquets turn brittle in the sun. Marble goes gray with the weight of time. But this grave set beneath a leaning willow, the stone merely swallowed by tangled grass, and lichen remains untouched by memory. I know because the registry, hand-inked and brittle, holds no entry for a visitor in over 40 years. I have asked every caretaker who came before me, and each one gives a slow shake of the head or a deflection, as if the question itself has grown mold. Yet every morning, when I do my rounds, I see the same sight waiting for me. Atop that weathered stone, A single red flower stands out startling in its defiance. Not a bouquet, never a cluster, but one perfect bloom, scarlet and unfurling, its petals slick as if always freshly cut. Rain, frost, the harshest sun, or even last winter's ice storm that toppled 2 trees, none of it has so much as curled the edge of a petal. I have seen entire funeral displays rot to pulp within days, watched roses and lily brought by grieving hands wither overnight. But this flower stays, bright as blood, never wilting, never disturbed. There are days I catch myself thinking it might not even be real, but then the wind picks up, and I see it stir trembling on its green stalk, as if answering some silent call. I asked the new groundsman, a quiet kid barely out of high school, if he'd ever seen anyone tending to the grave, perhaps some loyal soul slipping by at dawn. He just shrugged, eyes wary, and said no, not unless it happened when nobody was watching. One night, curiosity gnawed at me until I circled back after my shift, flashlight beam shivering over rows of names, dew settling in the grass. The air was sharper there, thinner somehow, and as I approached, I could swear I heard a faint rustling that didn't belong to the willow or the breeze, something in the earth itself. The flower was there, waiting, head turned just slightly toward me, its shadow long and strange in the moonlight. For a moment, it felt like the whole cemetery was holding its breath. I started leaving tiny markers on the grave, a pebble one night, a pressed leaf the next, trying to prove to myself that I was the only one who visited. But in the morning, my markers would be gone, replaced by nothing but the untouched flower. The ground was never disturbed, the grass never trampled, and yet I could not shake the feeling that the plot was not as forgotten as the record suggested. It was as if the grave itself was waiting, holding on to something or someone, a memory tethered by that stubborn red bloom that refused to die. It became a ritual for me to check the stone every day, and with each visit, the sense of being watched grew stronger, as if some presence lingered just beneath the surface, marking time not with footsteps, but with petals that never faded. Over the weeks, what began as idle curiosity grew into an obsession. The rest of the cemetery was ruled by the calendar, every living thing bowing to time, but that red flower defied all logic. One night a violent summer storm swept through, toppling branches and sending plastic vases tumbling. The next morning, the cemetery was a chaos of uprooted tributes and shredded petals, but the lone red flower stood upright, a single drop of water trembling on its tip like a jewel, untouched by the fury. I bent down, close enough to see the veins in its petals, half expecting to spot a wire or a stake holding it in place. But it was rooted in the earth, as alive and vulnerable as anything. Yet in that moment, the sunlight seemed to catch on the bloom that glimmer far too bright, as if some secret heat ran through its stem. Every day, no matter the weather hail that left dents in the shed roof, a drought that browned every blade of grass, even the frost that laced the iron gates, the flower refused to surrender. I found myself talking to it, at first out of habit, then as if I were leaving an offering, asking, "Who remembers you? What debt binds you here?" Each time I asked, a breeze would pick up, and the willow branches would hiss against the sky, carrying with them the faintest wisp of a voice. Not words exactly, but a presence, a feeling that belonged only to this corner of earth and stone. I even tried to watch from a distance, to see if anyone came in the night to change the flower or tend the grave. But I saw no one, only shadows lengthening and the moonlight turning the petals to black velvet. Sometimes, just as I was about to give up, I would hear a faint whistle through the headstones, a sigh that lingered too long, as if the grave itself exhaled at my presence. There were other signs, too, my own shadow seeming to curve toward the flower, leaves always swept away from the base, as though by careful hands. I went back to the cemetery records and scoured every page, finding nothing but the faded name on the stone, barely legible beneath the moss. No family, no history, just the date, 1957, yet the flower fresh, real, impossibly bright refused to die. That defiance gnawed at me, as if the grave and its guardian bloom were daring me to understand, to stay a little longer, to listen for the secret held just beneath the topsoil, waiting for the right person to hear it. And as the days turned to months, I realized I was returning not just to work, but to see if the impossible had finally given in. It never did. The flower's survival became a promise, or maybe a warning. Some memories, no matter how deeply buried, never let go. It was a bitter afternoon in late autumn when I decided to do what I'd long avoided: reach out and touch the flower. All morning, a chill wind had scraped across the headstones, rattling the dead leaves into corners and carrying the scent of old earth. The rest of the cemetery lay in the heavy stillness that precedes a frost, every shadow lengthening as clouds bruised the sky. I stood before the forgotten grave, boots sinking into the soft ground, and studied the red flower glistening as if painted by some unseen hand. At first, I hesitated, my fingers hovering just above the petals. Every instinct, every superstition I'd ever learned in this place screamed for caution. But curiosity can be cruel. The moment my fingertip brushed the bloom, a cold so deep and sudden shot through my hand that I jerked back in shock. It wasn't the ordinary bite of November air. This cold felt ancient, a chill that traveled up my arm and lodged itself in my chest like a memory of falling through ice. The world dimmed, the trees blurred at the edges of my vision. Then, just as I caught my breath, the wind swirled sharply around me. In the silence, a whisper seemed to coil from beneath the grave, rising up in a voice that was both foreign and achingly familiar. It spoke a single name, one I didn't know, but that lingered on my mind long after the wind faded, echoing like a refrain I'd heard in childhood dreams. I stumbled back, glancing at my hand, half expecting frostbite or some mark, but there was nothing. Only the lingering sense that something in me had been noticed, weighed, and not entirely welcomed. For hours afterward, I felt watched. Every shadow, every gust of wind seemed to bear the eyes of the forgotten. That night, I barely slept, the name from the grave repeating in my thoughts. I woke to find my hand colder than the rest of my body, the fingertips numb. When I returned to the cemetery the next morning, the flower looked even more vivid against the gray of the headstone, as if it drew energy from the memory of my touch. Still, the urge to know, to understand why this flower survived, whose name the wind kept chanting, had grown stronger. I began to wonder if some debts outlast death, or if some stories never truly find rest. And with each day, the flower's secret felt less like a curiosity and more like a calling, daring me to risk a little more, to listen a little closer, even as the cold lingered in my bones. Haunted by the icy sensation that lingered in my hand and the name that had rooted itself in my mind, I returned to the cemetery's modest office, a squat building lined with filing cabinets and shelves that sagged under the weight of yellowing ledgers. I'd never been much for paperwork. Too many Coviros came and went, leaving behind their own systems, their own preferred codes, but something in me insisted on digging deeper, as if answers might settle the unease growing in my chest. I started with the burial logs, tracing each fragile page with care. Most entries were as dry as the dust that coated the windowsills. Dates, names, simple notes about weather, or which family had come to weep. But when I searched for that section of the cemetery, the place where the unwilting red flower bloomed, I found only confusion. No recent burials, no recent visitors, only gaps in the records, as if someone had forgotten to log the plot. It took an hour before I found anything out of place, a ledger from the 1960s. Its leather spine cracked and brittle, open to a page where the handwriting dipped and slanted, hurried and nervous. There it was, that same name the wind had whispered, written in a wavering hand beside the word Desaparecido. No date of death, no ceremony, just the notation. Buried at request unclaimed, no family, flowers placed. Marked as per tradition. No one in the office could tell me who'd written it, or who'd ordered the burial. The page that followed mentioned the same name once again, this time in a list of those for whom the earth was not ready. I felt a shiver run up my spine, as I realized that every Coviro who'd left a note in the margins mentioned that flower, some in half-legible scrawl. Never wilts. Always red. Don't pick. The more I read, the more the cemetery seemed to close in around me. There were other similar notes on the edges of the old books. Stories of Coviros who had heard whispers, felt cold, seen the flowers glow in the moonlight, even glimpsed the shadow of a woman kneeling by the grave long after midnight. Some I saw with a start, described finding their own names scrawled on the bottom of pages after touching the flower, as if the very act of investigating tied them to the memory it protected. When I finally closed the ledger, the chill hadn't left my hand. I pressed my palm against the glass of the window, staring out at the far corner of the cemetery, where the red flower seemed to pulse like a tiny ember in the gloom. I wondered what it meant to be forgotten, to be marked only by a bloom that no one could pluck, and if perhaps every Coviro here had been chosen to remember so that the name on that grave and the cold secret it kept would never fully disappear. The next morning broke colder than the calendar could justify, an iron sky pressing low over the stones as I crossed the dew-heavy grass toward that corner of the cemetery. I had not slept. The name from the ledger spun through my head all night, curling around old memories. I could not quite place faces at funerals, hands clutching flowers, my own younger self watching from a distance. I knew I could not let the mystery go. If I was to keep my peace as Coviro, I had to know why the flower persisted, and what debt or memory kept it alive when all else around it faded to gray. As I approached, the air changed, the hush became deeper. The sounds of birds and distant traffic smothered as if I had stepped beneath a bell jar. The flower was there, impossibly vivid, dew collecting on its petals without weighing them down. I bent, not daring to pluck it, but instead to touch it gently at the base of the stem, wondering if the cold would come again. It did. A stabbing chill, as if the earth itself exhaled through my bones, and the whisper came back, unmistakable and close now. The same name, spoken with a timbre that blended my own voice with another's, older, worn by grief. I recoiled, but the flower seemed to pulse, and for a moment, no longer than a heartbeat, I saw another figure kneeling across from me, a shadow that might have been my mother, or her mother before, eyes filled with recognition and loss. I looked down and realized my own hand had trembled so violently that the soil beneath the flower was streaked with fresh marks, as if something underneath had stirred. I tried once more, gripping the stem. The cold worsened, pain spiking to my elbow, and the name repeated, then blurred into other names, some from my childhood, some I had only read in the ledger's Coviros. Vanished relatives, all tangled together by the act of memory. With a gasp, I let go. The air lightened. The flower stood, unharmed, bright as ever. I wiped my hands on my trousers and, for a moment, considered running, leaving the cemetery, the job, the endless cycle of names and farewells. But I knew, as every Coviro before me must have learned, that the red flower was never meant to be taken. It was a bond, a pact between the living and the lost, a memory of one who should not be forgotten. As long as it remained, his story stayed unfinished, the debt unpaid. That evening, as dusk washed the headstones in blue, I stood by the grave one last time. The wind rose, speaking the name in my ear, mingling with my own. I understood then that every Coviro who touched that flower gave something of themselves to keep the name alive. The memory was now part of me, and someday, if the flower ever faded, it would mean the world had finally let go. Until then, I would pass by every morning, nodding at the grave, the secret intact, a silent promise between the keeper and the kept, never to let the last flower fall. Story 9. It started subtly, in ways I could blame on bad luck or an aging vehicle. My funeral van, a battered white Chevy with the company's faded logo on the doors, had always been the most reliable in the fleet. I prided myself on keeping it that way. Oil changed every 3,000 miles. New battery last winter, tires rotated, even the fuses checked by a mechanic I'd trusted since my teens. But it was early March when I first noticed the hesitation. The sun was still out, right over the cracked concrete lot behind the funeral home, and I had a midday pickup at the hospital routine. Nothing more. I turned the key, and nothing happened. Not a cough, not a click, just the dead, indifferent silence of a vehicle refusing to cooperate. After a few minutes of checking the obvious, I called dispatch. They sent a backup van, made the usual jokes, and by the time I came back after dark to retrieve my personal things, I tried the key one last time. The engine turned over instantly, humming smooth and strong, as if mocking my earlier frustration. At first, I brushed it off as coincidence. Maybe the engine was too cold or the battery cables had jostled loose. But it kept happening, more predictably each day. No matter how many times I turned the key, the van wouldn't start while the sun was up. Not at dawn, not at noon, not even as the light faded orange over the city skyline. But as soon as darkness settled, the dash lights would blink awake, and the engine would growl to life with that same strange eagerness. I swapped batteries. I replaced the starter. I let 3 separate mechanics poke around under the hood, each more puzzled than the last. The van passed every test unless, of course, it was daylight. I started planning my routes around sunset, telling myself I was just being cautious, not superstitious. Still, there was something about the way the van seemed to wake up with the night that made me uneasy. I kept telling myself it was just an old vehicle with a quirky electrical problem. But even the mechanics stopped offering explanations. Some cars just have a mind of their own, one of them joked. But it didn't feel like a joke anymore. Not when I sat behind the wheel in the dim-lit garage, waiting for dusk, and felt a quiet, inexplicable anticipation settle over the driver's seat. It wasn't just the van that changed after dark. I noticed the way the headlights cut through the fog differently, how the dashboard glowed a little brighter, how the radio sometimes hummed static between stations no matter what frequency I dialed in. I started to feel as though the van was waiting for someone to set it in motion, but only once the world outside turned shadowed and silent. By the end of that first strange week, I stopped telling people about the problem. I just accepted it. In the light, the van was dead. At night, it lived. And each time I turned the key in darkness, I wondered if it was really me in control, or if something in that ancient engine was deciding when and where I'd drive next. It wasn't long before the pattern began to shape the rest of my life. I'd given up on day shifts, handed them off to the younger guys in the company. None of them wanted the late-night calls anyway. The official explanation, which I half believed myself, was that my van only ran after dark, and I was just adapting until the mechanics could find a fix. But as the weeks dragged on, something stranger settled into my routine. Every new assignment, every pickup or delivery came in well after sunset, usually as the clock ticked past 10 p.m. sharp. At first, it seemed like a practical joke by dispatch. Maybe they were keeping me busy. Maybe they knew I hated early mornings. But the more I checked, the less sense it made. My name would only appear on the after-hours logs, always for services logged as urgent, but with no family waiting, no church ceremony, no paperwork to hand off in person. The calls themselves started to feel odd. Instead of coming through the company radio, my cell would ring with a blocked number, the voice on the other end low and clipped, never using names, just giving the address, a time, and sometimes a whispered, "Don't be late." No one ever called me back for updates, and when I tried to trace the number, it would come up unlisted or once, as my own home number, something that made my stomach clench with a kind of slow, cold dread. I'd drive the night streets with the radio off, watching the neighborhoods change from bright lit to shuttered, from the city's hum to back roads where even the streetlights seemed to avoid shining. The names on the service slips were unfamiliar, strange spellings, sometimes just initials, sometimes nothing but unknown, no family present. The addresses were even stranger: a boarded-up building on the outskirts of town, a decommissioned nursing home, a derelict warehouse by the old rail yard. Once, I was sent to a motel long abandoned, the only car in the lot mine. Headlights bouncing off windows thick with dust and old police tape. What unsettled me most wasn't just the loneliness, or the way the van's headlights seemed to reach a little further into the dark now, but the nagging sense that someone or something was keeping careful watch over my route. Each night, as the clock in the dash hit 10:07, the phone would buzz. Sometimes I'd answer, sometimes I'd let it ring. Either way, the next pickup would be waiting. It was as if the van, and the city itself, belonged to a different set of rules after midnight rules that only made sense in the hush, between street lamps and under the hush of empty sidewalks. Even my coworkers began to keep their distance. I'd see them in the break room, hear their jokes about the night shift curse, and watch their faces change when they realized which van I was driving. They wouldn't say it outright, but no one wanted my schedule or my calls. The paperwork always matched up, at least on the surface. But sometimes I'd find a slip dated 2 days ahead, or a receipt with my own signature already written, even though I'd just picked up the pen. It all began to blur, days into nights, routines into rituals, and the van itself humming quietly in the lot, never moving until the sun was gone. And something on the other end of the line told me where to go next. By the third week, I stopped bothering to ask questions about the routes. It became a silent understanding between me, the van, and whatever force seemed to dictate my schedule. I'd get in after dark, turn the key, and the GPS would flicker to life all on its own, never with the same interface twice. Sometimes it showed the city grid, sometimes a winding black line with no street names, just a blinking dot and the words, "Proceed to destination." Other nights, it glowed in a sickly blue, with the screen shuddering as if under static, only giving me an arrow pointing off the usual roads, into places I'd never taken a funeral vehicle. One night, I tried to take a shortcut. I knew well a route through the center of town. Wide streets and plenty of lights, but the GPS recalculated, insistent, rerouting me back toward a side street that cut behind a row of abandoned factories. I could have ignored it, but when I did, the van's headlights dimmed and the engine shuddered, forcing me to pull over as if the machine itself was rebelling. Every time I returned to the original path, the van purred along smoothly, the dashboard lights steady and bright. I gave in, more out of unease than obedience. The destinations were never repeated, and they never made sense. I drove to a playground at midnight, only to find the gates swinging open on rusty hinges, a single swing moving in the breeze, though the air was perfectly still. Another night, the GPS led me down a 2-lane highway to a stretch of old farmland, where the fields glowed silver under the moon, and a barn stood empty, its doors wide as if waiting for me. Once, the device showed no map at all, just a blank screen and the words "You are here," even as the van glided through dark, unmarked streets that didn't seem to exist in daylight. At first, I thought fatigue was playing tricks on me, but the mileage logs always matched up. Receipts printed from the dash were stamped with the correct time and address, though sometimes the city listed was spelled wrong, or the state abbreviation was for somewhere hundreds of miles away. My phone's GPS could never track my route. The location would bounce between coordinates, sometimes disappearing altogether for hours at a time. More disturbing were the times I'd arrive at a location and find nothing, no building, no lights, just an empty lot or a locked gate. The GPS would announce, in a tinny automated voice, "You have reached your destination," and I'd wait there, the van idling, until I heard a tap at the rear door or a shuffling step behind me. Sometimes there was a delivery to make, a package or envelope that I never remembered loading, with instructions I couldn't recall reading. Other times, I'd return to the lot and find the cargo space empty, though I knew I'd started the drive with something inside. I began to realize the van was guiding me to places not just off the map, but outside of anything the city or my own memory recognized. It was as if the vehicle had its own sense of purpose, one that unfolded only after dark. with the GPS as its silent conductor, directing me into the hidden corners of a city that belonged to the night alone. That night, the fourth Friday in a row of sleepless evenings and restless miles, the GPS took on a new kind of urgency. The screen glowed a deep, unnatural green, the route line pulsing as if alive, drawing me toward the far outskirts of the city, where the old industrial parks gave way to farmland, and then to nothing but fields and tree lines. There were no other cars on the road, not even the glow of porch lights in the distance. The van's headlights seemed swallowed by the darkness, the only constant the unwavering arrow on the GPS, leading me past every familiar landmark and into uncharted territory. I kept glancing at the clock, but the dashboard time crept backward and forward with no logic. Minutes doubling back on themselves, the digital numbers flickering in a way that made me rub my eyes. By the time I realized we'd left paved roads behind, the GPS read simply, "Approaching destination." I found myself at the end of a rutted lane, tire tracks disappearing into tall grass, a set of wrought iron gates looming ahead tall, blackened and padlocked with chains so rusted they looked centuries old. The display on the GPS switched to a new message. Arrived, but outside I saw no evidence of arrival, no sign, no lights, no hint of a cemetery. Yet as I peered through the gates, my eyes adjusted to the gloom, and I made out the faint silhouettes of gravestones stretching in uneven rows, half buried in weeds and shadow. The moon slipped from behind a cloud just then, painting the stones in a silvery pallor, revealing carvings so weathered I couldn't make out any names. I left the van running, clutching my clipboard more for comfort than duty, and approached the gate. No sounds reached me, but the dull, ceaseless hum of insects and the whisper of grass. Still, I felt watched, 100 invisible eyes trained on my every step. I rattled the gate, expecting resistance, but the chain fell away in my hands, dropping to the ground with a hollow clang that echoed across the stones. The air inside the cemetery was colder, thick with a dampness that settled on my skin. The van's headlights, aimed through the gate, barely lit the path ahead, but I followed instinct, shoes crunching on gravel until I reached a clearing. There, in the center of the burial ground, stood a single freshly dug grave. No marker, no flowers, just an open rectangle of earth waiting under the open sky. I knew, without knowing how, that I was meant to deliver something to that spot, but when I turned to retrieve the cargo, whatever it had been, my hands met only empty space. A noise behind me made me spin, heart hammering. From the darkness between the stones, a figure drifted into the moonlight, indistinct and silent, shrouded in black as if wearing the night itself. It didn't approach, didn't speak. It only raised an arm and pointed at the open grave, its gesture heavy with expectation. My feet refused to move. For a moment, I wondered if the van would start if I tried to leave, or if it too was waiting, caught in the web of this place that no map claimed and no living soul had reason to visit. When I finally forced myself to return to the van, the GPS had shut off completely, screen black, the faint smell of turned earth lingering in the air. My route home was different streets unfamiliar, buildings out of place, and every sign I passed blank as a headstone. I didn't sleep that morning. I only lay awake, certain I delivered something that could never be named, to a cemetery that shouldn't exist, guided by a van that, when dawn finally came, sat dead and silent in the driveway, waiting for night to fall again. The sun never seemed to truly rise after that night. Every morning bled into a haze of exhausted wakefulness, and I started losing track of the days, barely registering the hours as they slipped away in a fog. My van remained parked in my driveway, doors locked, engine cold to the touch, utterly unresponsive in the daylight, no matter how many times I tried to turn the key. But as soon as night crept in and the city's streetlights flickered on, a silent signal pulsed through me, a call that made my palms itch for the familiar weight of the steering wheel, no matter how desperately I tried to resist. Every evening I found myself outside again, headlights slicing the dark, the GPS whispering directions to places I didn't recognize. Some nights, I tried to fight it, left the keys inside, unplugged the battery, even took a cab to the other side of town and spent hours at an all-night diner, hoping the van's spell would break. But always, inevitably, I'd glance up at the windows and see my own van idling in the parking lot, engine running, waiting for me as if I'd never left. The staff would shake their heads when I asked about it. They'd only seen me arrive alone. Even strangers I met along these endless routes seemed barely real, flickering in and out of the glow of the dashboard as if conjured by my memory alone. Each journey blurred into the next. The only constant was the van, and the way it would glide through deserted streets at midnight, or park itself before gates that had never existed the day before. Sometimes the cargo space would be empty. Sometimes I'd find an unmarked casket, or an urn, or, once, a bundle of dried flowers tied with black ribbon that left ash on my hands when I tried to move it. No two trips ever took me down the same roads twice, yet I always circled back to the same dark cemeteries that never appeared on any city records. My phone filled with missed calls from the funeral home, from my boss, from people I was sure I hadn't spoken to years. But the messages were always the same. The night shift needs you. There's a delivery to be made. Don't be late. My own name started showing up on route sheets for jobs I'd never taken, and the dates next to them sometimes fell years in the future, sometimes decades in the past. One morning, exhausted and shaking, I found the van already running in the garage, the radio tuned to static and the GPS blinking, begin route. My reflection in the window looked older, the circles under my eyes deepening with every nocturnal drive. I opened the back doors and saw, for a split second, myself standing in the aisle of a midnight chapel, holding a bouquet of those blackened flowers. I slammed the door shut, heart pounding, and when I turned around, I was back in the driver's seat, already pulling out into the empty road. It never ends. That's the truth I learned after countless nights behind the wheel of that van. No matter how far I drove, no matter how many deliveries I completed, or how many cemeteries I visited, dawn never truly came for me. I became another ghost on the night roads, ferrying the forgotten, the lost, and sometimes myself. The van only knows one direction, forward, into the dark, where the ride never stops, and every passenger is already waiting. Story 10. It started with a phone call that felt like it came from nowhere, a voice too neutral to place, reading from a list too specific to have been compiled by a stranger. The co-Vero 40 years in the business, not prone to nerves, listened in silence as the caller described, down to the color of the lily on the altar and the exact arrangement of the velvet chairs, every detail of a funeral to be held in 3 days' time. The deceased was unnamed, the client anonymous, but the order was signed and prepaid, the details immaculate. There would be a string quartet for the prelude, a program of readings that included passages from a book the co-Vero had read only in his childhood, and a list of guests so precise he recognized several names as neighbors and old colleagues from the small towns where he'd once worked. There were instructions for a slideshow featuring photos that upon inspection he found were tucked away in a battered box under his own bed, untouched since his wife had passed a decade earlier. The caller ended the conversation with a familiar phrase, a saying his grandmother used to repeat, except she'd been gone half his life. When he tried to call the number back, it rang only once before disconnecting. In the days that followed, vendors arrived on schedule with arrangements and supplies, each with receipts addressed to the co-Vero's own home, each insistent that he had ordered them himself. The funeral home's office received emails from his personal account, confirming each booking, though he had no memory of sending a single one. He began to wonder, in the quiet moments before dawn, if this was some elaborate joke or a gentle breakdown, his mind weaving one last tapestry from the threads of a life spent among farewells. Yet the meticulousness of it all, every hymn selected, every reading chosen from a book he'd marked as a child, every small detail tailored to memories he'd never shared, left him uneasy in a way no empty casket ever had. When the morning of the service arrived, he dressed as he always did, in his best black suit, the same one he wore to his wife's funeral, the same one he'd always thought would someday be worn to his own. He carried the programs and checked the flowers, walking through the chapel like a stranger in his own story, each step echoing with the certainty that this ceremony, so perfectly crafted, was not just for a stranger. And as the first guests began to arrive, faces from every era of his life, their smiles tinged with a kind of solemn recognition, he realized that whoever had planned this event knew him better than anyone left alive. As the guests filtered into the chapel, the Coviro found himself moving through a tide of faces, some faded with age, others almost painfully vivid in his memory. They greeted him not as an employee or host, but as if he were the very reason for their presence, their eyes shining with a strange intimacy. At first, he attributed it to the small-town closeness, the kind of community where everyone knows everyone else's story. But soon it became clear that the knowledge these people possessed ran deeper than casual acquaintance. One woman pressed his hand with a warmth that sent a shiver up his arm and whispered the childhood nickname only his father ever used. A man in the second row recounted, in casual conversation with another guest, the day the Coviro lost his wedding ring while planting roses beside his wife's grave, a moment he had never spoken of, not even to his children. A former schoolmate, who he thought had left the state decades ago, recalled details about the old wooden bridge they'd once jumped from into the creek, right down to the scrape he'd gotten on his knee and the words he'd muttered through gritted teeth. There were former clients, neighbors from houses he hadn't seen in years, distant relatives whose faces seemed to blur into the crowd, but whose voices were unmistakable. The snippets of conversation he overheard were all about him, stories from his youth, struggles he'd thought were private, triumphs he barely remembered himself. He walked through the chapel and caught snatches of dialogue. That winter when his mother was sick and he stayed up all night. Or the way he whistled that old hymn when he thought no one was listening. The air vibrated with nostalgia and something heavier, as if every secret he'd ever kept was being gently exhumed for inspection. Each anecdote carried a weight, a reminder that the boundaries between public and private had dissolved. The realization began to settle on him like dust that this gathering was less about mourning, another and more about unearthing every corner of his own life. When he looked up at the front of the chapel, the flowers spelled out his own initials. The unease in his stomach deepened into something almost superstitious, as if the assembled guests were not just paying their respects, but waiting for the moment when the line between guest and subject would vanish, and he would find himself the only one left standing, or perhaps lying in repose. As the ceremony progressed, the Coviro tried to busy himself with the details, adjusting a crooked wreath, collecting the stray programs left on empty chairs, but his attention kept returning to the pulpit. One by one, the guests rose to speak. Each carried a folded page or a note card, but none mentioned the name of the official deceased, whose details he himself had prepared with painstaking care. Instead, each speaker turned toward the Coviro, addressing him directly or speaking as though he were the invisible centerpiece around which all stories orbited. An old teacher recounted how he'd once volunteered to help dig out a stuck school bus in the snow, mentioning the exact date, the shovels, the freezing air, and the laughter that had echoed across the playground. A neighbor spoke of the nights when a soft yellow light would burn late in his window, and how she took comfort knowing someone was always awake, always watching over the quiet streets. Someone from the city council stood, and with an odd mix of humor and reverence, recalled the time the Coviro fixed the cemetery gates after a storm, refusing payment and simply nodding. The dead need their peace more than the living need their convenience. The anecdotes kept coming. A favorite childhood song hummed in the hallway. The way he paused every morning to feed the stray cat by the stone wall. The silent prayers he'd offered at every burial, even when no one else was around. Each speech was gentle, respectful, almost loving, but none was for the supposed decedent lying at the front. It became impossible to ignore. The program listed a series of formal eulogies for someone else, but the words, the glances, the atmosphere all pointed to him. The walls of the chapel seemed to press closer, echoing every story with a strange clarity. He felt exposed, each private habit, every small kindness or hidden regret, illuminated for all to see. The murmurs grew softer, more focused, until finally, an elderly woman with trembling hands approached the lectern and said simply, "He always thought of this place as home." Perhaps he knew, better than any of us, that the final gathering would be for him. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind that falls after a verdict has been read. The Coviro stood in the back, heart pounding, certain that he had become the center of his own rehearsal, an audience of ghosts and memories, celebrating a life not quite finished, but already remembered in full. Standing at the edge of the gathering, the Coviro felt the hush fall heavier with each word spoken in his honor, his mind sifting through every face, every anecdote, trying to piece together how so many details intimate, precise, quietly devastating, could be known by people he barely recognized. As the last speech faded into the stillness, someone called his name with gentle insistence, inviting him to the front. The pulpit, which moments ago had felt like any other fixture in 1,000 ceremonies, now seemed to radiate a peculiar gravity, as if it had been waiting for him all along. With slow steps he approached, feeling the eyes of the congregation, some wet with tears, others lit with a strange, sympathetic understanding, resting upon him with the full weight of memory and expectation. The atmosphere shifted. The programs in guests' hands now bore his name, the dates lining up with moments only he could remember. The day his mother died, the birthday he spent alone in the rain, the first time he dug a grave in this very cemetery, hands raw and trembling. On the walls, old photographs flickered and changed, showing him at different ages, as a child in Sunday clothes, as a young man shoveling in winter, as the silent figure in the background of 100 funerals. The air carried a scent of earth, wax, and wilted lily his world, distilled. Then, as if scripted, a voice recited his favorite poem, the one he had whispered to himself before every service, the only prayer he truly believed in. Even the pallbearers who had helped set up the hall stood quietly with heads bowed, though none of them seemed to recognize one another when he searched their faces. When the final speaker finished, the room did not move. It simply waited. He was not merely a participant in this event, nor just a facilitator. He was the axis around which every memory spun. The Coviro's breath caught as realization spread through his body. This ceremony was not for someone else, not a mere dry run, but a meticulously rehearsed farewell to his own life. Each guest, each whispered secret, each detail had come together for this unspoken rehearsal, a gentle, communal preparation for the moment he would truly leave. In that instant, he knew that death was not always sudden. Sometimes it was a slow gathering, a ceremony held while the guest of honor was still breathing, still walking, but already part of the past in the eyes of those who cared enough to remember. After the last words drifted into silence, and the soft shuffle of departing feet filled the echoing chapel, the Coviro lingered near the altar, numb with the revelation that every detail of this night had been orchestrated for him. The guests left quietly, most without speaking, some offering small, knowing nods as they slipped through the doors into the cool darkness beyond. The candles sputtered and dimmed one by one, casting long shadows across the empty pews. Alone now, the Coviro turned to the guest book, an old volume that had traveled from ceremony to ceremony over the years, its pages yellowed and soft, ink from hundreds of pens bleeding into thin lines and careful loops. He opened to the last entry, expecting to see the name of the deceased he'd been told to honor, but found instead his own, written in unmistakable handwriting, the familiar flourish at the end of his surname. The line was complete, his name, the date of the ceremony, the word departed, written in the column where he'd marked so many others. There was no doubt. The signature was his. As he traced the line with a trembling finger, Memories from the evening flickered at the edges of his mind, snatches of conversation, the subtle way every story had circled back to him. The old woman who had pressed his hand and whispered, "You've done enough. Now rest." For a moment, he questioned his sanity, whether exhaustion had finally overtaken his senses. But the ink on the page was still fresh, smudging slightly beneath his thumb. On impulse, he flipped through the preceding pages, looking for other entries that might have been overlooked, and saw variations of his name stretching back through time, sometimes as a mourner, sometimes as the departed, always present at funerals that felt half-remembered, half-dreamed. As the church clock struck midnight, a chill swept the room. The shadows deepened, and the air felt suddenly thick, heavy with unshed words. It struck him that the true rehearsal had already ended, and this moment alone with the book and his own handwriting was the final act. He understood finally that every Covero must someday bury himself, not in earth, but in memory and farewell. When he closed the book and left it on the altar, his footsteps made no sound, and the doors seemed to open of their own accord, ushering him into the quiet night where, for the first time, he felt more a memory than a man, the honored guest at a ceremony only the dead truly understand.